Christianity and the Western Transition. Few readers of this book are likely to have heard of Abgar, far less of his East Syrian kingdom, Osroene, yet this little-known and obscure monarch was long believed to be the first Christian king. In fact, the story of his conversion is a legend, since he died in 68 BC, it seems to have been under his descendant, Abgar IX, that Osroene became Christian at the end of the 2nd century AD. The conversion may not even have included the king himself, but this did not trouble hagiographers. They placed Abgar and his Nabatean Arabic state at the head of a long and great tradition. In the end it was to incorporate virtually the whole history of monarchy in Europe. From there it was to spread to influence rulers in other parts of the world. All these monarchs would behave differently because they saw themselves as Christian, yet, important though it was, this is only a tiny part of the difference Christianity has made to history. Until the coming of industrial society, in fact, it is one of the few historical phenomena we have to consider whose creative power and impact are comparable with the great determinants of prehistory in shaping the world we live in. Christianity grew up within the classical world of the Roman Empire, fusing itself in the end with its institutions and spreading through its social and mental structures to become our most important legacy from that civilization. Often disguised or muted, its influence runs deep in the countries that were shaped by it. Almost incidentally, it defined Europe. That continent and others are what they are today because a handful of Jews saw their teacher and leader crucified and believed he rose again from the dead. The Jewishness of Christianity is fundamental and was probably its salvation, to speak in worldly terms, for the odds against the historical survival, let alone worldwide success, of a small sect centered upon a holy man in the Roman Eastern Empire were enormous. Judaism was a matrix and protecting environment for a long time as well as the source of the most fundamental Christian ideas. In return, Jewish ideas and myths were to be generalized through Christianity to become world forces. At the heart of these was the Jewish view that history was a meaningful story, providentially ordained, a cosmic drama of the unfolding design of the one omnipotent God for his chosen people. Through his covenant with that people could be found guidance for right action, and it lay in adherence to his law. The breaking of that law had always brought punishment, such as had come to the whole people in the deserts of Sinai and by the waters of Babylon. In obedience to it lay the promise of salvation for the community. This great drama was the inspiration of Jewish historical writing, in which the Jews of the Roman Empire discerned the pattern which made their lives meaningful. That mythological pattern was deeply rooted in Jewish historical experience, which, after the great days of Solomon, had been bitter, fostering an enduring distrust of the foreigner and an iron will to survive. Few things are more remarkable in the life of this remarkable people than the simple fact of its continued existence. The exile which began in 587 BC. When Babylonian conquerors took many of the Jews away after the destruction of the temple was the last crucial experience in the molding of their national identity before modern times. It finally crystallized the Jewish vision of history. The exiles heard prophets like Ezekiel promise a renewed covenant. Judah had been punished for its sins by exile and the temple's destruction. Now God would turn his face again to Judah, who would return again to Jerusalem, delivered out of Babylon as Israel had been delivered out of Egypt. The temple would be rebuilt. Perhaps only a minority of the Jews of the exile heeded this, but it was a significant minority and it included Judah's religious and administrative elite, if we are to judge by the quality of those, again, probably a minority, who, when they could do so, returned to Jerusalem, a saving remnant, according to prophecy. Before that happened, the experience of the exile had transformed Jewish life as well as confirming the Jewish vision. Scholars are divided as to whether the more important developments took place among the exiles or among the Jews who were left in Judah to lament what had happened. In one way or another, though, Jewish religious life was deeply stirred. The most important change was the implanting of the reading of the Scriptures as the central act of Jewish religion. While the Old Testament was not to assume its final form for another 3 or 4 centuries, the first 5 books, or Pentateuch, traditionally ascribed to Moses, were substantially complete soon after the return from the exile. They contained the promise of a future and guidance to its achievement through maintenance of the law, now given a new detail and coherence. This was one of the slow effects of the work of the interpreters and scribes who had to reconcile and explain the sacred books. In the end, there was to grow out of their weekly meetings both the institution of the synagogue and a new liberation of religion from locality and ritual, however much and long Jews continued to pine for the restoration of the temple. The Jewish religion could eventually be practiced wherever Jews could come together to read the scriptures. They were to be the first of the peoples of a book, and Christians and Muslims were to follow them. It made possible greater abstraction and universalizing of the vision of God. There was a narrowing, too. Although Jewish religion might be separated from the temple cult, some prophets had seen the redemption and purification which must lie ahead as only to be approached through an even more rigid enforcement of what was now believed to be Mosaic law. Ezra brought back its precepts from Babylon, and observances which had been in origin those of nomads were now imposed rigorously on an increasingly urbanized people. The self-segregation of Jews became much more important and obvious in towns. It was seen as a part of the purification which was needed that every Jew married to a Gentile wife, and there must have been many, should divorce her. This was after the Persian overthrow of Babylon. In 539 BC, some of the Jews took the opportunity offered to them and came back to Jerusalem. The temple was rebuilt during the next 25 years, and Judah became under Persian overlordship a sort of theocratic satrapy. In the 5th century, when Egypt revolted against Persian rule, this was a strategically sensitive area, and it was governed lightly and with the help of the native priestly aristocracy. This provided the political articulation of Jewish nationhood until Roman times. With the ending of Persian rule, the age of Alexander's heirs brought new problems. After being ruled by the Ptolemies, the Jews eventually passed to the Seleucids. The social behavior and thinking of the upper classes underwent the influence of Hellenization. This sharpened divisions by exaggerating contrasts of wealth and differences between townsmen and countrymen. It also separated the priestly families from the people, who remained firmly in the tradition of the law and the prophets, as expounded in the synagogues. The Great Maccabean Revolt broke out, 168 to 164 BC. Against a Seleucid king of Hellenistic Syria, Antiochus IV, and cultural westernization approved by the priests but resented by the masses. Antiochus had tried to go too fast, not content with the steady erosion of Jewish insularity by Hellenistic civilization and the friction of example. He had interfered with Jewish rites and profaned the temple by seeking to turn it into the temple of Olympian Zeus. Perhaps, though, he only wished to open the temple complex to all worshippers, as was normal for any temple in a Hellenistic city. After the revolt had been suppressed with difficulty, and guerrilla warfare went on long after, a more conciliatory policy was resumed by the Seleucid kings. It did not satisfy many Jews, who in 142 BC were able to take advantage of a favorable set of circumstances to win an independence which was to last for nearly 80 years. Then, in 63 BC, Pompey imposed Roman rule, and there disappeared the last independent Jewish state in the Middle East for nearly 2,000 years. Independence had not been a happy experience. A succession of kings drawn from the priestly families had thrown the country into disorder by innovation and high-handedness. They and the priests who acquiesced in their policies excited opposition. They were challenged in their authority by a new, more austere school of interpreters, who clung to the law, rather than the temple cult, as the heart of Judaism and gave it new and searchingly rigorous interpretation. These were the Pharisees, the representatives of a reforming strain which was time and time again to express itself in Jewry in protest against the danger of creeping Hellenization. They also accepted proselytism among non-Jews, teaching a belief in the resurrection of the dead and a divine last judgment. There was a mixture in their stance of national and universal aspiration, and they drew out further the implications of Jewish monotheism. Most of these changes took place in Judea, the tiny rump of the once great kingdom of David. Fewer Jews lived there in the time of Augustus than in the rest of the empire. From the 7th century BC onwards they had spread over the civilized world. The armies of Egypt, Alexander and the Seleucids all had Jewish regiments. Others had settled abroad in the course of trade. One of the greatest Jewish colonies was at Alexandria, where they had gathered from about 300 BC. The Alexandrian Jews were Greek speakers. There the Old Testament was first translated into Greek, and when Jesus was born there were probably more Jews there than in Jerusalem. In Rome there were another 50,000 or so. Such agglomerations increased the opportunities to proselytize and therefore the danger of friction between communities. Jewry offered much to a world where traditional cults had waned. Circumcision and dietary restraints were obstacles, but were far outweighed for many a proselyte by the attractions of a code of behavior of great minuteness, a form of religion not dependent on temples, shrines or a priesthood for its exercise, and, above all, the assurance of salvation. A prophet whose teaching was ascribed by the Old Testament compilers to Isaiah, but who was almost certainly of the Exile, had already announced a message to bring light to the Gentiles, and many of them had responded to that light long before the Christians, who were to promote it in a new sense. The proselytes could identify themselves with the chosen people in the great story which inspired Jewish historical writing, the only achievement in this field worthy of comparison with the Greek invention of scientific history, and one which gave meaning to the tragedies of the world. In their history the Jews discerned an unfolding pattern by which they were being refined in the fire for the day of judgment. A fundamental contribution of Jewry to Christianity would be its sense of the people apart, its eyes set on things not of this world. Christians were to go on to develop the idea of the leaven in the lump, working to redeem the world. Both myths were deeply rooted in Jewish historical experience and in the remarkable though simple fact of this people's survival at all. The big communities of Jews and Jewish proselytes were important social facts to Roman governors, standing out not only because of their size but because of their tenacious separateness. Archaeological evidence of synagogues as special and separate buildings does not appear until well into the Christian era, but Jewish quarters in cities were distinct, clustering about their own synagogues and courts of law. While proselytizing was widespread and even some Romans were attracted by Jewish belief, there were also early signs of popular dislike of Jews in Rome itself. Rioting was frequent in Alexandria and easily spread to other towns of the Middle East. This led to distrust on the part of authorities and, at least at Rome, to the dispersal of Jewish communities when things became difficult. Judea itself was regarded as a particularly ticklish and dangerous area, and to this the religious ferment of the last century and a half BC had greatly contributed. In 37 BC the Senate appointed a Jew, Herod the Great, king of Judea. He was an unpopular monarch. No doubt there was popular distaste for a Roman nominee and a ruler anxious, with reason, to preserve the friendship of Rome. Herod earned further dislike, though, by the Hellenistic style of life at his court, though he was careful to display his loyalty to the Jewish religion, and by the heavy taxes which he raised, some of them for grandiose building. Even if it were not for the legendary massacre of the innocents and his place in Christian demonology, Herod would not have had a good historical press. At his death, in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided between his 3 sons, an unsatisfactory arrangement which was superseded in AD 6 when Judea became part of the Roman province of Syria, governed from Caesarea. In AD 26 Pontius Pilate became procurator, the taxing officer or, effectively, governor, an uncomfortable and exacting post he was to hold for 10 years. It was a bad moment in the history of a turbulent province. Something of a climax to the excitements of nearly 2 centuries was being reached. The Jews were at loggerheads with their Samaritan neighbors and resented an influx of Greek Syrians noticeable in the coastal towns. They detested Rome as the latest of a long line of conquerors and also because of its demands for taxes. Tax gatherers, the publicans of the New Testament, were unpopular not just because of what they took but because they took it for the foreigner. Worse still, the Jews were also bitterly divided among themselves. The great religious festivals were often stained by bloodshed and rioting. Pharisees, for instance, were deeply antagonistic to Sadducees, the formalizing representatives of the aristocratic priestly caste. Other sects rejected them both. One of the most interesting has become known to us only in recent years, through the discovery and reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which it can be seen to have promised its adherents much that was also offered by early Christianity. It looked forward to a last deliverance which would follow Judea's apostasy and would be announced by the coming of a Messiah. Jews attracted by such teaching searched the writings of the prophets for the prefigurings of these things. Others sought a more direct way. The Zealots looked to the nationalist resistance movement as the way ahead. Into this electric atmosphere Jesus was born in about 6 BC. Into a world in which thousands of his countrymen awaited the coming of a Messiah, a leader who would lead them to military or symbolic victory and inaugurate the last and greatest days of Jerusalem. The evidence for the facts of his life is contained in the records written down after his death in the Gospels, the assertions and traditions which the early church based on the testimony of those who had actually known Jesus. The Gospels are not by themselves satisfactory evidence, but their inadequacies can be exaggerated. They were no doubt written to demonstrate the supernatural authority of Jesus and the confirmation provided by the events of his life for the prophecies which had long announced the coming of the Messiah. This interested and hagiographical origin does not demand skepticism about all the facts asserted. Many have inherent plausibility in that they are what might be expected of a Jewish religious leader of the period. They need not be rejected. Much more inadequate evidence about far more intractable subjects has often to be employed. There is no reason to be more austere or rigorous in our canons of acceptability for early Christian records than for, say, the evidence in Homer which illuminates Mycenae. Nevertheless, it is very hard to find corroborative evidence of the facts stated in the Gospels in other records. The picture of Jesus presented in them is of a man of modest though not destitute family, with a claim to royal lineage. Such a claim would no doubt have been denied by his opponents if there had not been something in it. Galilee, where Jesus grew up, was something of a frontier area for Judaism, where it was most exposed to the contact with Syrian Greeks, which often irritated religious sensibilities. There preached in the neighborhood a man called John, a prophet to whom crowds had flocked in the days before his arrest and execution. Scholars have tried to link John with the Qumran community, which left behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. He appears, though, to have been a solitary, highly individual figure, a teacher modeling himself on the prophets. One evangelist tells us that he was the cousin of Jesus. This is possibly true, but less important than the agreement of all the Gospels that John baptized Jesus as he baptized countless others who came to him fearing the approach of the last day. He is also said to have recognized in Jesus a teacher like himself and perhaps something more. Art thou he that cometh, or look we for another? Jesus knew himself to be a holy man. His teaching and the evidence of his sanctity, which was seen in miracles, soon convinced the excited multitude to follow him to Jerusalem. His triumphal entry into the city was based on their spontaneous feeling. They followed him as they followed other great teachers in the hope of the Messiah that was to come. The end came with a charge of blasphemy before the Jewish court and the relaxation of the letter of Roman law by Pilate in order to avoid further trouble in a violent city. Jesus was not a Roman citizen, and for such men the extreme penalty was crucifixion after scourging. The inscription on the cross on which he was nailed read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This was a Roman governor's political irony, and that the significance of it should not go unnoted was ensured by posting the words in Latin, Greek and Hebrew. This was probably in AD 33, though AD 29 and AD 30 have also been put forward as dates. Shortly after his death, Jesus' disciples believed that he had risen from the dead, that they had seen him and his ascension into heaven, and that they had received a divine gift of power from him at Pentecost which would sustain them and their adherents until the last day. That would soon come, they also believed, and would bring back Jesus as the judge sitting at the right hand of God. All this the Gospels tell us. If this was what the first Christians saw in Christ, as he came to be called, from the Greek word meaning the Anointed One, there were also in his teaching other elements capable of far wider application. The reported devotional ideas of Jesus do not go beyond custom. Jewish service in the temple and observance of traditional holy days and feasts, together with private prayer, were all that he indicated. In this very real sense, he lived and died a Jew. His moral teaching, though, focused upon repentance and deliverance from sin, and upon a deliverance available to all, not just to Jews. Retribution had its part in Jesus' teaching, On this the Pharisees agreed with him. Strikingly, most of the more terrifying things said in the New Testament are attributed to him. Fulfillment of the law was essential. Yet it was not enough. Beyond observance lay the duties of repentance and restitution in the case of wrong done, even of self-sacrifice. The law of love was the proper guide to action. Emphatically, Jesus rejected the role of the political leader. A political quietism was one of the meanings later discerned in a dictum which was to prove to be of terrible ambiguity: "My kingdom is not of this world." Yet a Messiah who would be a political leader was expected by many. Others sought a leader against the Jewish religious establishment and therefore were potentially a danger to order even if they aimed only at religious purification and reform. Inevitably, Jesus, of the house of David, became a dangerous man in the eyes of the authorities. One of his disciples was Simon the Zealot, an alarming associate because he had been a member of an extremist sect. Many of Jesus' teachings encouraged feeling against the dominant Sadducees and Pharisees, and they in their turn strove to draw out any anti-Roman implication which could be discerned in what he said. Such facts provide the background to Jesus' destruction and the disappointment of the people. They do not explain the survival of his teaching. He had appealed not only to the politically dissatisfied but to Jews who felt that the law was no longer guide enough and to non-Jews who, though they might win second-class citizenship of Israel as proselytes, wanted something more to assure them of acceptance at the day of judgment. Jesus had also attracted the poor and outcast. They were many in a society which offered enormous contrasts of wealth and no mercy to those who fell by the wayside. These were some of the appeals and ideas which were to yield in the end an astonishing harvest. Yet though they were effective in his own lifetime, they seemed to die with him. At his death his followers were only one tiny Jewish sect among many. But they believed that a unique thing had happened. They believed that Christ had risen from the dead, that they had seen him, and that he offered to them and those that were saved by his baptism the same overcoming of death and personal life after God's judgment. The generalization of this message and its presentation to the civilized world was achieved within a half-century of Jesus' death. The conviction of the disciples led them to remain at Jerusalem, an important center of pilgrimage for Jews from all over the Middle East, and therefore a seminal center for a new doctrine. Two of Jesus' disciples, Peter and Jesus' brother James, were the leaders of the tiny group which awaited the imminent return of the Messiah, striving to prepare for it by penitence and the service of God in the temple. They stood emphatically within the Jewish fold. Only the rite of baptism, probably, distinguished them. Yet other Jews saw in them a danger. Their contacts with Greek-speaking Jews from outside Judea led to questioning of the authority of the priests. The first martyr, Stephen, one of this group, was lynched by a Jewish crowd. One of those who witnessed this was a Pharisee from Tarsus of the tribe of Benjamin, named Paul. It may have been that as a Hellenized Jew of the dispersion he was especially conscious of the need for orthodoxy. He was proud of his own. Yet he is the greatest influence in the making of Christianity after Jesus himself. Somehow, Paul underwent a change of heart. From being a persecutor of the followers of Christ, he became one himself. It seems to have followed a sojourn of meditation and reflection in the deserts of East Palestine. Then, in AD 47, or perhaps earlier, dating Paul's life and travels is a very uncertain business, he began a series of missionary journeys which took him all over the eastern Mediterranean. In AD 49, an apostolic council at Jerusalem took the momentous decision to send him as a missionary to Gentiles, who would not be required to undergo the circumcision, which was the most important act of submission to the Jewish faith. It is not clear whether he, the council, or both in agreement were responsible. There were already little communities of Jews following the new teaching in Asia Minor, where it had been carried by pilgrims. Now these were given a great consolidation by Paul's efforts. His especial targets were Jewish proselytes, Gentiles to whom he could preach in Greek and who were now offered full membership of Israel through the new covenant. The doctrine that Paul taught was new. He rejected the law, as Jesus had never done, and strove to reconcile the essentially Jewish ideas at the heart of Jesus' teaching with the conceptual world of the Greek language. He continued to emphasize the imminence of the coming end of things, but offered all nations, through Christ, the chance of understanding the mysteries of creation and, above all, of the relationship of things seen and things invisible, of the spirit and the flesh, and of the overcoming of the second by the first. In the process, Jesus became more than a human deliverer who had overcome death, and was God himself, and this was to shatter the mold of Jewish thought within which the faith had been born. There was no lasting place for such an idea within Jewry, and Christianity was now forced out of the temple. The intellectual world of Greece was the first of many new resting places it was to find as the centuries went by. A colossal theoretical structure was to be built on this change. The Acts of the Apostles give plentiful evidence of the uproar which such teaching could cause and also of the intellectual tolerance of the Roman administration when public order was not involved. But it often was. In AD 59, Paul had to be rescued from the Jews at Jerusalem by the Romans. When put on trial in the following year, he appealed to the emperor as a Roman citizen and to Rome he went, apparently with success. From that time he is lost to history. He may have perished in a persecution by Nero in AD 67. The first age of Christian missions permeated the civilized world by sinking roots everywhere in the first place in the Jewish communities. The churches which emerged were administratively wholly independent of one another, though the community at Jerusalem was recognized to have an understandable primacy. There were to be found those who had seen the risen Christ and their successors. The only links of the churches other than their faith were the institutional one of baptism, the sign of acceptance in the new Israel, and the ritual practice of the Eucharist, the reenactment of the rites performed by Jesus at his Last Supper with his disciples, the evening before his arrest. It has remained the central sacrament of the Christian churches to this day. The local leaders of the churches exercised independent authority in practice, therefore, but this did not cover much. There was nothing except the conduct of the affairs of the local Christian community to be decided upon, after all. Meanwhile, Christians expected Christ's second coming. Such influence as Jerusalem had flagged after AD 70, when a Roman sack of the city dispersed many of the Christians there. After this time Christianity had less vigor within Judea. By the beginning of the 2nd century the communities outside Palestine were clearly more numerous and more important and had already evolved a hierarchy of officers to regulate their affairs. These identified the three later orders of the Church: bishops, presbyters and deacons. Their priestly functions were at this stage minimal, and it was their administrative and governmental roles which mattered. The response of the Roman authorities to the rise of a new sect was largely predictable. Its governing principle was that when no specific cause for interference existed, new cults were tolerated unless they awoke disrespect or disobedience to the empire. There was a danger at first that the Christians might be confounded with other Jews in a vigorous Roman reaction to Jewish nationalist movements, which culminated in a number of bloody encounters, but their own political quietism and the announced hostility of other Jews saved them. Galilee itself had been in rebellion in AD 6, perhaps a memory of it influenced Pilate's handling of the case of a Galilean among whose disciples was a zealot, but a real distinction from Jewish nationalism came with the Great Jewish Rising of AD 66. This was the most important in the whole history of Jewry under the empire, when the extremists gained the upper hand in Judea and took over Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus has recorded the atrocious struggle which followed, the final storming of the temple, the headquarters of resistance, and its burning after the Roman victory. Before this, the unhappy inhabitants had been reduced to cannibalism in their struggle to survive. Archaeology has recently revealed at Marzada, a little way from the city, what may well have been the site of the last stand of the Jews before it, too, fell to the Romans in AD 73. This was not the end of Jewish turbulence, but it was a turning point. The extremists never again enjoyed such support and must have been discredited. The law was now more than ever the focus of Jewishness, for the Jewish scholars and teachers, after this time, they are more and more designated as rabbis, had continued to unfold its meaning in centers other than Jerusalem while the revolt was in progress. Their good conduct may have saved these Jews of the dispersion. Later disturbances were never so important as had been this great revolt, though in AD 117 Jewish riots in Cyrenaica developed into full-scale fighting, and in AD 132 The last Messiah, Simon bar Kochba, launched another revolt in Judea. But the Jews emerged with their special status at law still intact. Jerusalem had been taken from them. Hadrian made it an Italian colony, which Jews might enter only once a year, but their religion was granted the privilege of having a special officer, a patriarch, with sovereignty over it, and they were allowed exemption from the obligations of Roman law which might conflict with their religious duties. This was the end of a volume of Jewish history. For the next 1,800 years Jewish history was to be the story of communities of the dispersion, until a national state was again established in Palestine among the debris of another empire. The nationalists of Judea apart, Jews elsewhere in the empire were for a long time thereafter safe enough during the troubled years. Christians did less well, though their religion was not much distinguished from Judaism by the authorities. It was, after all, only a variant of Jewish monotheism with, presumably, the same claims to make. It was the Jews, not the Romans, who first persecuted it, as the crucifixion itself, the martyrdom of Stephen and the adventures of Paul have shown. It was a Jewish king, Herod Agrippa, who, according to the author of the Acts of the Apostles, first persecuted the community at Jerusalem. It has even appeared plausible to some scholars that Nero, seeking a scapegoat for a great fire at Rome in AD 64, should have had the Christians pointed out to him by hostile Jews. Whatever the source of this persecution, in which, according to popular Christian tradition, St. Peter and St. Paul both perished, and which was accompanied by horrific and bloody scenes in the arena, it seems to have been for a long time the end of any official attention by Rome to the Christians. They did not take up arms against the Romans in the Jewish revolts, and this must have soothed official susceptibilities with regard to them. When they emerge in the administrative records as worth notice by government, it is in the early 2nd century AD. This is because of the overt disrespect which Christians were by then showing in refusing to sacrifice to the emperor and the Roman deities. This was their distinction. Jews had a right to refuse. They had possessed a historic cult which the Romans respected, as they always respected such cults, when they took Judah under their rule. The Christians were now clearly seen as distinct from Jews and were a recent creation. Yet the Roman attitude was that although Christianity was not legal, it should not be the subject of general persecution. If, on the other hand, breaches of the law were alleged, and the refusal to sacrifice might be one, then the authorities should punish when the allegations were specific and shown in court to be well-founded. This led to many martyrdoms, as Christians refused the well-intentioned attempts of Roman civil servants to persuade them to sacrifice or abjure their god, but there was no systematic attempt to eradicate the sect. Indeed, the authorities' hostility was much less dangerous than that of the Christians' fellow subjects. As the 2nd century passed, there is more evidence of pogroms and popular attacks on Christians, who were not protected by the authorities since they followed an illegal religion. They may sometimes have been acceptable scapegoats for the administration or lightning conductors diverting dangerous currents. It was easy for the popular mind of a superstitious age to attribute to Christians the offenses to the gods which led to famine, flood, plague and other natural disasters. Other equally convincing explanations of these things were lacking in a world with no other technique for explaining natural disaster. Christians were alleged to practice black magic, incest, even cannibalism, an idea no doubt explicable in terms of misleading accounts of the Eucharist. They met secretly at night. More specifically and acutely, though we cannot be sure of the scale of this, the Christians threatened by their control of their members the whole customary structure which regulated and defined the proper relations of parents and children, husbands and wives, masters and slaves. They proclaimed that in Christ there was neither bound nor free, and that he had come to bring not peace but a sundering sword to families and friends. It was prescient of pagans to sense danger in such views. Christianity's greatest contribution to a later Western civilization would be its stubbornly prophetic and individualistic assertion that life should be regulated with reference to a moral guidance independent not only of government but of any other merely human authority. It is not hard, therefore, to understand the violent outbursts in the big provincial towns, such as that at Smyrna in AD 165, or Lyons in 177. They were the popular aspect of an intensification of opposition to Christianity which had an intellectual counterpart in the first attacks on the new cult by pagan writers. Persecution was not the only danger facing the early church. Possibly it was the least grave. A much more serious one was that it might develop into just another cult of the kind of which many examples could be seen in the Roman Empire and, in the end, be engulfed like them in the magical morass of ancient religion. All over the Middle East could be found examples of the mystery religions, whose core was the initiation of the believer into the occult knowledge of a devotion centered on a particular god. The Egyptian Isis was a popular one, the Persian Mithras another. Almost always the believer was offered the chance to identify himself with the divine being in a ceremony which involved a simulated death and resurrection, and thus to overcome mortality. Such cults offered, through their impressive rituals, the peace and liberation from the temporal which many craved. They were very popular. That there was a real danger that Christianity might develop in this way is shown by the importance in the 2nd century of the Gnostics. Their name derives from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. The knowledge the Christian Gnostics claimed was a secret, esoteric tradition, not revealed to all Christians but only to a few. One version said only to the apostles and the sect to which it had subsequently descended. Some of their ideas came from Zoroastrian, Hindu and Buddhist sources which stressed the conflict of matter and spirit in a way which distorted the Judeo-Christian tradition. Some came from astrology and even magic. There was always a temptation in such a dualism, the attribution of evil and good to opposing principles and entities and the denial of the goodness of the material creation. The Gnostics were haters of this world, and in some of their systems this led to the pessimism typical of the mystery cults. Salvation was only possible by the acquisition of arcane knowledge, secrets of an initiated elect. A few Gnostics even saw Christ not as the Savior who confirmed and renewed a covenant but as one who delivered men from Yahweh's error. It was a dangerous creed in whatever form it came, for it cut at the roots of hopefulness which was the heart of the Christian revelation. It turned its back on the redemption of the here and now of which Christians could never wholly despair, since they accepted the Judaic tradition that God made the world and that it was good. In the 2nd century, with its communities scattered throughout the Jewish diaspora and their organizational foundations fairly firmly settled, Christianity thus seems to stand at a parting of ways, either of which could prove fatal to it. Had it turned its back on the implications of Paul's work and remained merely a Jewish heresy, it would at best have been reabsorbed eventually into the Judaic tradition. On the other hand, a flight from Jewry, which rejected it, might have driven Christians into the Hellenistic world of the mystery cults or the despair of the Gnostics. Thanks to a handful of men, it escaped both and became a promise of salvation to the individual. The achievement of the Fathers of the Church who navigated these perils was, for all its moral and pietistic content, above all intellectual. They were stimulated by their danger. Irenaeus, who succeeded the martyred Bishop of Lyons in AD 177, provided the first great outline of Christian doctrine, a creed and definition of the scriptural canon. All of these set off Christianity from Judaism. But he wrote also against the background of the challenge of heretical beliefs. In AD 172 the First Church Council had met to reject Gnostic doctrines. Christian doctrine was squeezed into intellectual respectability by the need to resist the pressures of competitors. Heresy and orthodoxy were born twins. One of the pilots who steered an emerging Christian theology through this period was the prodigiously learned Clement of Alexandria, a Christian Platonist, perhaps born in Athens, through whom Christians were brought to an understanding of what the Hellenistic tradition might mean apart from the mysteries. In particular, he directed Christians to the thought of Plato. To his even greater pupil, Origen, he transmitted the thought that God's truth was a reasonable truth, a belief which could attract men educated in the Stoic view of reality. The intellectual drive of the early fathers and the inherent social appeal of Christianity made it possible for it to utilize the huge possibilities of diffusion and expansion inherent in the structure of the classical and later Roman world. Its teachers could move freely and talk and write to one another in Greek. It had the great advantage of emerging in a religious age. The monstrous credulousness of the 2nd century cloaks deep longings. They hint that the classical world is already running out of vigor. The Greek capital needed replenishment, and one place to look for it was in new religions. Philosophy had become a religious quest, and rationalism or skepticism appealed only to an infinitesimally small minority. Yet this promising setting was also a challenge to the Church. Early Christianity has to be seen always in the context of thriving competitors. To be born in a religious age was a threat as well as an advantage. How successfully Christianity met the threat and seized its opportunity was to be seen in the crisis of the 3rd century, when the classical world all but collapsed and survived only by colossal, and in the end mortal, concession. After AD 200 there are many signs that Romans were beginning to look back on the past in a new way. Men had always talked of golden ages in the past, indulging in a conventional, literary nostalgia. But the 3rd century brought something new, a sense of conscious decline. Historians have spoken of a crisis, but its most obvious expressions were in fact surmounted. The changes Romans carried out or accepted by the year 300 gave a new lease of life to much of classical Mediterranean civilization. They may even have been decisive in ensuring that it would in the end transmit so much of itself to the future. Yet the changes themselves took a toll, for some of them were essentially destructive of the spirit of that civilization. Restorers are often unconscious imitators. Somewhere around the beginning of the 4th century we can sense that the balance has tipped against the Mediterranean heritage. It is easier to feel it than to see what was the crucial moment. The signs are a sudden multiplication of ominous innovations. The administrative structure of the empire is rebuilt on new principles, its ideology is transformed, the religion of a once obscure Jewish sect becomes established orthodoxy, and physically, large tracts of territory are given up to settlers from outside, alien immigrants. A century later still, and the consequence of these changes is apparent in political and cultural disintegration. The ups and downs of imperial authority mattered a lot in this process. Classical civilization had come by the end of the 2nd century AD to be coterminous with the empire. It was dominated by the conception of Romanitas, the Roman way of doing things. Because of this, the weaknesses of the structure of government were fundamental to what was going wrong. The imperial office had long since ceased to be held, as Augustus had carefully pretended, by the agent of the Senate and people. The reality was a despotic monarch, his rule tempered only by such practical considerations as the placating of the Praetorian Guard on which he depended. A round of civil wars which followed the accession of the last, inadequate, Antonine emperor in 180 opened a terrible era. This wretched man, Commodus, was strangled by a wrestler at the bidding of his concubine and chamberlain in 192, but that solved nothing. From the struggles of 4 emperors in the months following his death there finally emerged an African, Septimius Severus, married to a Syrian, who strove to base the empire again on heredity, attempting to link his own family with the Antonine succession and thus to deal with one fundamental constitutional weakness. This was really to deny the fact of his own success. Severus, like his rivals, had been the candidate of a provincial army. Soldiers were the real emperor makers throughout the 3rd century, and their power lay at the root of the empire's tendency to fragment. Yet the soldiers could not be dispensed with, indeed, because of the barbarian threat, now present on several frontiers simultaneously, the army had to be enlarged and pampered. Here was a dilemma to face emperors for the next century. Severus's son Karakala, who prudently began his reign by bribing the soldiers heavily, was none the less murdered by them in the end. In theory the Senate still appointed the emperor. In fact it had little effective power except in so far as it could commit its prestige to one of a number of contending candidates. This was not much of an asset but still had some importance so long as maintaining the old forms had some moral effect. It was inevitable, though, that the arrangements should intensify the latent antagonism of Senate and emperor. Severus gave more power to officers drawn from the equestrian class, socially inferior to the senatorial families. Karakala inferred that a purge of the Senate would help and took this further step towards autocratic rule. More military emperors followed him. Soon there was for the first time one who did not come from the senatorial ranks, though he was from the equites. Worse was to follow. In 235 Maximinus, a huge ex-ranker from the Rhine legions, contested the prize with an octogenarian from Africa who had the backing of the African army and, eventually, of the Senate. Many emperors were murdered by their troops. One died fighting his own commander-in-chief in battle, his conqueror subsequently being slain by the Goths after his betrayal to them by one of his other officers. It was a dreadful century. Altogether, 22 emperors came and went, and that number does not include mere pretenders, or such semi-emperors as Postumus, who for a while maintained himself in Gaul, thus prefiguring a later division of the empire. Though Severus's reforms had for a time improved matters, the fragility of his successor's position accelerated a decline in administration. Karakala was the last emperor to try to broaden the basis of taxation by making all free inhabitants of the empire Roman citizens and thus liable to inheritance taxes, but no fundamental fiscal reform was attempted. Perhaps decline was inevitable, given the emergencies to be faced and the resources available. With irregularity and extemporization went growing rapacity and corruption as those with power or office used it to protect themselves. This reflected another problem, the economic weakness which the empire was showing in the 3rd century. Few generalizations are safe about what this meant to the consumer and supplier. For all its elaboration and organization around a network of cities, the economic life of the empire was overwhelmingly agrarian. Its bedrock was the rural estate, the villa, large or small, which was both the basic unit of production and also, in many places, of society. Such estates were the source of subsistence for all those who lived on them, and that meant nearly all the rural population. Probably, therefore, most people in the countryside were less affected by the long-term swings of the economy than by the requisitioning and heavier taxation which resulted from the empire ceasing to expand. The armies had to be supported from a narrower base. Sometimes, too, the land was devastated by fighting. But peasants lived at subsistence level, had always been poor, and continued to be so, whether bound or free. As times got worse, some sought to bind themselves as serfs, which suggests an economy in which money was in retreat before payment in goods and services. It also probably reflects another impact of troubled times such as drove peasants to the towns or to banditry. Men everywhere sought protection. Requisitioning and higher taxation may in some places have helped to produce depopulation, though the 4th century provides more evidence of this than the 3rd, and to this extent was self-defeating. In any case, they were likely to be inequitable, for many of the rich were exempt from taxation and the owners of the estates cannot have suffered much in inflationary times unless they were imprudent. The continuity of many of the great estate-owning families in antiquity does not suggest that the troubles of the 3rd century bit deeply into their resources. The administration and the army felt most of the effects of economic troubles, and particularly the major ill of the century, inflation. Its sources and extent are complex and still disputed. In part it derived from an official debasement of the coinage which was aggravated by the need to pay tribute in bullion to barbarians who from time to time were best placated by this means. But barbarian incursions themselves often helped to disrupt supply, and this again told against the cities, where prices rose. Because the soldiers' pay was fixed, it fell in real value. This made them, of course, more susceptible to generals who offered lavish bribes. Although the overall impact is hard to assess, it has been suggested that money may have fallen during the century to about 1/50th of its value at the beginning. The damage showed both in the towns and in imperial fiscal practice. From the 3rd century onwards many towns shrank in size and prosperity. Their early medieval successors were only pale reflections of the important places they once had been. One cause was the increasing demands of the imperial tax collectors. From the beginning of the 4th century the depreciation of coin led imperial officials to levy taxes in kind. They could often be used directly to supply local garrisons but were also the means of payment to civil servants, and this not only made the government more unpopular, but also the curials, or municipal office holders, who had the task of raising these impositions. By 300 they often had to be forced to take office, a sure sign that a once sought-after dignity had become a strenuous obligation. Some towns suffered from actual physical damage, too, especially those in the frontier regions. Significantly, as the 3rd century wore on, towns well within the empire began to rebuild, or build for the first time, walls for their protection. Rome began again to fortify itself soon after 270. Meanwhile, the army steadily grew bigger. If the barbarians were to be kept out, it had to be paid, fed and equipped. If the barbarians were not kept out, there would be tribute to pay to them instead. And there was not only the barbarian to contend with. Only in Africa was the imperial frontier reasonably secure against Rome's neighbors, because there were no neighbors there who mattered. In Asia things were much grimmer. Ever since the days of Sulla, a cold war with Parthia had flared up from time to time into full-scale campaigning. Two things prevented the Romans and Parthians from ever really settling down peacefully. One was the overlapping of their spheres of interest. This was most obvious in Armenia, a kingdom which was alternately a buffer and shuttlecock between them for a century and a half, but the Parthians also dabbled in the disturbed waters of Jewish unrest, another sensitive matter for Rome. The other factor making for disturbance was the temptation presented to Rome time and time again by Parthia's own internal dynastic troubles. Such facts had already led in the 2nd century AD to intense fighting over Armenia, its details often obscure. Severus eventually penetrated Mesopotamia but had to withdraw. The Mesopotamian valleys were too far away. The Romans were trying to do too much and faced the classic problem of overextended imperialism. But their opponents were tiring and at low ebb, too. Parthian written records are fragmentary, but the tale of exhaustion and growing incompetence emerges from a coinage declining into unintelligibility and blurred derivations from earlier Hellenized designs. In the 3rd century Parthia disappeared, but the threat to Rome from the east did not. A turning point was reached in the history of the old area of Persian civilization. In about 225 a king called Ardashir, later known in the West as Artaxerxes, killed the last king of Parthia and was crowned in Ctesiphon. He was to recreate the Achaemenid Empire of Persia under a new dynasty, the Sassanids. It would be Rome's greatest antagonist for more than 400 years. There was much continuity here. The Sassanid Empire was Zoroastrian, as Parthia had been, and evoked the Achaemenid tradition as Parthia had done. Within a few years the Persians had invaded Syria and opened 3 centuries of struggle with the empire. In the 3rd century there was not a decade without war. A massive attempt by the Romans to drive the Sassanids back ended in disaster in 260. Emperor Valerian, who had led the Roman troops, was taken prisoner by the Persians, the only Roman emperor ever who suffered such a fate at the hands of foreigners. The Persian king, Shapai, reportedly had Valerian's body flayed after the unfortunate Roman died in captivity, and preserved his stuffed skin as a trophy. For the rest of the 3rd century the battles raged back and forth, but neither power managed to get a decisive advantage over the other. The outcome was a long-drawn-out and ding-dong contest. A sort of equilibrium grew up in the 4th and 5th centuries, and only in the 6th did it begin to break down. Meanwhile, commercial ties appeared. Though trade at the frontier was officially limited to 3 designated towns, important colonies of Persian merchants came to live in the great cities of the empire. Persia, moreover, lay across trade routes to India and China, which were as vital to Roman exporters as to those who wanted Oriental silk, cotton and spices. Yet these ties did not offset other forces. When not at war, the two empires tended to coexist with cold and cautious hostility. Their relations were complicated by communities and peoples settled on both sides of the frontier, and there was always the danger of the strategic balance being upset by a change in one of the buffer kingdoms, Armenia, for instance. The final round of open struggle was put off, but came at last in the 6th century. This is to jump too far ahead for the present. By then huge changes had taken place in the Roman Empire which have still to be explained. The conscious dynamism of the Sassanid monarchy was only one of the pressures encouraging them. Another came from the barbarians along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. The origins of the folk movements which propelled them forward in the 3rd century and thereafter must be sought in a long development and are less important than the outcome. These peoples grew more insistent, acted in larger groupings and, in the end, had to be allowed to settle inside Roman territory. Here they were first engaged as soldiers to protect the empire against other barbarians and then, gradually, began to take a hand in running the empire themselves. In 200 this still lay in the future. All that was clear then was that new pressures were building up. The most important barbarian peoples involved were the Franks and Alemanni on the Rhine and the Goths on the lower Danube. From about 230 the empire was struggling to hold them off, but the cost of fighting on two fronts was heavy. His Persian entanglements soon led one emperor to make concessions to the Alemanni. When his immediate successors added their own quarrels to their Persian burdens, the Goths took advantage of a promising situation and invaded Moesia, the province immediately south of the Danube, killing an emperor there, En Passant, in 251. 5 years later, the Franks crossed the Rhine. The Alemanni followed and got as far as Milan. Gothic armies invaded Greece and raided Asia and the Aegean from the sea. Within a few years the European dams seemed to give way everywhere at once. The scale of these incursions is not easy to establish. Perhaps the barbarians could never field an army of more than 30,000. But this was too much at any one place for the imperial army. Its backbone was provided by recruits from the Illyrian provinces. Appropriately, it was a succession of emperors of Illyrian stock who turned the tide. Much of what they did was simple good soldiering and intelligent extemporization. They recognized priorities. The main dangers lay in Europe and had to be dealt with first. An alliance with Palmyra helped to buy time against Persia. Losses were cut. Trans-Danubian Dacia was abandoned in 270. The army was reorganized to provide effective mobile reserves in each of the main danger areas. This was all the work of Aurelian, whom the Senate significantly called restorer of the Roman Empire. But the cost was heavy. A more fundamental reconstruction was implicit if the work of the Illyrian emperors was to survive, and this was the aim of Diocletian. A soldier of proven bravery, he sought to restore the Augustan tradition but revolutionized the empire instead. Diocletian had an administrator's genius rather than a soldier's. Without being especially imaginative, he had an excellent grasp of organization and principles, a love of order and great skill in picking and trusting men to whom he could delegate. He was also energetic. Diocletian's capital was wherever the imperial retinue found itself. It moved about the empire, passing a year here, a couple of months there, and sometimes only a day or two in the same place. The heart of the reforms which emerged from this court was a division of the empire intended to deliver it both from the dangers of internal quarrels between pretenders in remote provinces and from the overextension of its administrative and military resources. In 285 Diocletian appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, with responsibility for the empire west of a line running from the Danube to Dalmatia. The two Augusti were subsequently each given a Caesar. As coadjutor, these were to be both their assistants and successors, thus making possible an orderly transfer of power. In fact, the machine of succession only once operated as Diocletian intended, at his own abdication and that of his colleague, but the practical separation of administration in two imperial structures was not reversed. After this time all emperors had to accept a large measure of division even when there was nominally still only one of them. There also now emerged explicitly a new conception of the imperial office. No longer was the title princeps employed, the emperors were the creation of the army, not the Senate, and were deferred to in terms recalling the semi-divine kingship of Oriental courts. Practically, they acted through pyramidal bureaucracies. Dioceses, responsible directly to the emperors through their vicars, grouped provinces much smaller and about twice as numerous as the old ones had been. The senatorial monopoly of governmental power had long since gone. Senatorial rank now meant in effect merely a social distinction, membership of the wealthy landowning class, or occupation of one of the important bureaucratic posts. The rank of equites disappeared altogether. The military establishment of the Tetrarchy, as it was called, was much larger, and therefore more expensive, than that laid down originally by Augustus. The theoretical mobility of the legions, deeply dug into long-occupied garrisons, was abandoned. The army of the frontiers was now broken up into units, some of which remained permanently in the same place while others provided new mobile forces smaller than the old legions. Conscription was reintroduced. Something like 500,000 men were under arms. Their direction was wholly separated from the civilian government of the provinces with which it had once been fused. The results of this system do not seem to have been exactly what Diocletian envisaged. They included a considerable measure of military recovery and stabilization, but its cost was enormous. An army, whose size doubled in a century, had to be paid for by a population which had probably already begun to shrink. Heavy taxation not only compromised the loyalty of the empire's subjects and encouraged corruption, it also required a close control of social arrangements so that the tax base should not be eroded. There was great administrative pressure against social mobility. The peasant, for example, was obliged to stay where he was recorded at the census. Another celebrated, though so far as can be seen totally unsuccessful, example was the attempt to regulate wages and prices throughout the empire by a frieze. Such efforts, like those to raise more taxation, meant a bigger civil service, and as the number of administrators increased so, of course, did the overheads of government. In the end, Diocletian probably achieved most by opening the way to a new view of the imperial office itself. The religious aura which it acquired was a response to a real problem. Somehow, under the strain of continued usurpation and failure, the empire had ceased to be unquestioningly accepted. This was not merely because of dislike of higher taxation or fear of its growing numbers of secret police. Its ideological basis had been eroded and it could not focus men's loyalties. A crisis of civilization was going on as well as a crisis of government. The spiritual matrix of the classical world was breaking up, neither state nor civilization was any longer to be taken for granted, and they needed a new ethos before they could be. An emphasis on the unique status of the emperor and his sacral role was one early response to this need. Consciously, Diocletian acted as a savior, a Jupiter-like figure holding back chaos. Something in this recalled affinities with those thinkers of the late classical world who saw life as a perpetual struggle between good and evil. Yet this was a vision not Greek or Roman at all, but Oriental. The acceptance of a new vision of the emperor's relation to the gods, and therefore of a new conception of the official cult, did not bode well for the traditional practical tolerance of the Greek world. Decisions about worship might now decide the fate of the empire. These possibilities shaped the history of the Christian churches for both good and ill. In the end, Christianity was to be the legatee of Rome. Many religious sects have risen from the position of persecuted minorities to become establishments in their own right. What sets the Christian Church apart is that this took place within the uniquely comprehensive structure of the late Roman Empire, so that it both attached itself to and strengthened the lifeline of classical civilization, with enormous consequences not only for itself but for Europe and, ultimately, the world. At the beginning of the 3rd century, missionaries had already carried the faith to the non-Jewish peoples of Asia Minor and North Africa. Particularly in North Africa, Christianity had its first mass successes in the towns. It long remained a predominantly urban phenomenon. But it was still very much a minority faith, and throughout the empire the old gods and the local deities held the peasants' allegiance. By the year 300, Christians may have made up only about a tenth of the population of the empire. But there had already been striking signs of official favor and even concession. One emperor had been nominally a Christian and another had included Jesus Christ among the gods honored privately in his household. Such contacts with the court illustrate an interplay of Jewish and classical culture, which is an important part of the story of the process by which Christianity took root in the empire. Perhaps Paul of Tarsus, the Jew who could talk to Athenians in terms they understood, had launched this. Later, early in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, a Palestinian Greek, had striven to show that Christianity had a debt to Greek philosophy. This had a political point. Cultural identification with the classical tradition helped to rebut the charge of disloyalty to the empire. If a Christian could stand in the ideological heritage of the Hellenistic world, he could also be a good citizen, and Justin's rational Christianity, even though he was martyred for it in about 165, envisaged a revelation of the divine reason in which all the great philosophers and prophets had partaken, Plato among them, but which was only complete in Christ. Others were to follow similar lines, notably the learned Clement of Alexandria, who strove to integrate pagan scholarship with Christianity, and Origen, though his exact teaching is still debated because of the disappearance of many of his writings. A North African Christian, Tertullian, had contemptuously asked what the Academy had to do with the Church. He was answered by the Church Fathers, who deliberately employed the conceptual armory of Greek philosophy to provide a statement of the faith which anchored Christianity to rationality as Paul had not done. When coupled to its promise of a salvation after death and the fact that the Christian life could be lived in a purposeful and optimistic way, such developments might lead us to suppose that Christians were by the 3rd century confident about the future. In fact, favorable portents were much less striking than the persecutions so prominent in the history of the early Church. There were 2 great outbreaks. That of the middle of the century expressed the spiritual crisis of the establishment. It was not only economic strain and military defeat that were troubling the empire, but a dialectic inherent in Roman success itself. The cosmopolitanism which had been so much the mark of the empire was, inevitably, a solvent of the Romanitas, which was less and less a reality and more a slogan. The Emperor Decius seems to have been convinced that the old recipe of a return to traditional Roman virtue and values could still work. It implied the revival of service to the gods, whose benevolence would then be once more deployed in favor of the empire. The Christians, like others, must sacrifice to the Roman tradition, said Decius, and many did, to judge by the certificates issued to save them from persecution. Some did not, and died. A few years later, Valerian renewed persecution on the same grounds, though his proconsuls addressed themselves rather to the directing personnel and the property of the Church, its buildings and books, than to the mass of believers. Thereafter, persecution ebbed and the Church resumed its shadowy, tolerated existence just below the horizon of official attention. Persecution had shown, nevertheless, that it would require great efforts and prolonged determination to eradicate the new sect. It may even have been already beyond the capacities of Roman government to carry out such an eradication. The exclusiveness and isolation of early Christianity had waned. Christians were increasingly prominent in local affairs in the Asian and African provinces. Bishops were often public figures with whom officials expected to do business. The development of distinct traditions within the faith, those of the churches of Rome, Alexandria and Carthage being the most important, spoke for the degree to which it was rooted in local society and could express local needs. Outside the empire, too, there had been signs that better times might lie ahead for Christianity. The local rulers of the client states under the shadow of Persia could not afford to neglect any source of local support. Respect for widely held religious views was at least prudent. In Syria, Cilicia and Cappadocia, Christians had been very successful in their missionary work, and in some towns they formed a social elite. Simple superstition, too, helped to convince kings the Christian God might prove powerful, and it could hardly be damaging to ensure against his ill will. Thus Christianity's political and civic prospects improved. Christians noted with some satisfaction that their persecutors did not prosper. The Goths slew Decius, and Valerian's fate has already been noted. But Diocletian did not appear to draw any conclusions from this, and in 303 launched the last great Roman persecution. It was not at first harsh. The main targets were Christian officials, clergy and the books and buildings of the Church. The books were to be handed over for burning, but for some time there was no death penalty for failing to sacrifice. Many Christians nonetheless did sacrifice, the bishop at Rome among them. Constantius, the Caesar of the West, did not enforce the persecution after 305, when Diocletian abdicated, though his eastern colleague, Diocletian's successor, Galerius, felt strongly about it, ordering a general sacrifice on pain of death. This meant that persecution was worst in Egypt and Asia, where it was kept up a few years longer. But before this it had been cut across by the complicated politics which led to the emergence of the Emperor Constantine the Great. This was the son of Constantius, who died in Britain in 306, a year after his accession as Augustus. Constantine was there at the time, and although he had not been his father's Caesar, he was hailed as emperor by the army at York. A troubled period of nearly 2 decades followed. Its intricate struggles demonstrated the failure of Diocletian's arrangements for the peaceful transmission of the empire and only ended in 324, when Constantine reunited the empire under one ruler. By this time he had already addressed himself vigorously and effectively to its problems, though with more success as a soldier than as an administrator. Often with barbarian recruits, he built up a powerful field army distinct from the frontier guards. It was stationed in cities within the empire. This was a strategically sound decision which proved itself in the fighting power the empire showed in the east for the next 2 centuries. Constantine also disbanded the Praetorian Guard and created a new, German, bodyguard. He restored a stable gold currency and paved the way to the abolition of payments of taxes in kind and the restoration of a money economy. His fiscal reforms had more mixed results but attempted some readjustment of the weight of taxation so that more should be borne by the rich. None of these things, though, struck contemporaries as much as his attitude to Christianity. Constantine gave the church official houseroom. He thus played a more important part in shaping its future than any other Christian layman, and was to be called the 13th apostle. Yet his personal relationship to Christianity was complicated. He grew up intellectually with the monotheistic predisposition of many late classical men and was in the end undoubtedly a convinced believer. It was not then unusual for Christians to do as he did and postpone baptism until their deathbed. But he believed out of fear and hope, for the God he worshipped was a God of power. His first adherence was to the sun god whose sign he bore and whose cult was already officially associated with that of the emperor. Then, in 312, on the eve of battle, and as a result of what he believed to be a vision, he ordered his soldiers to put on their shields a Christian monogram. This showed a willingness to show suitable respect to whatever gods there might be. He won the battle and thenceforth, though continuing publicly to acknowledge the cult of the sun, he began to show important favors to the Christians and their god. One manifestation of this was an edict the following year, which was issued by another of the contenders for the empire after agreement with Constantine at Milan. It restored to Christians their property, and granted them the toleration that other religions enjoyed. The justification may reveal Constantine's own thinking as well as his wish to arrive at a satisfactory compromise formula with his colleague, for it explained its provisions by the hope that whatever divinity dwells in the heavenly seat may be appeased and be propitious towards us and to all who are placed under our authority. Constantine went on to make considerable gifts of property to the churches, favoring, in particular, that of Rome. Besides providing important tax concessions to the clergy, he conferred an unlimited right to receive bequests on the church. Yet for years his coins continued to honor pagan gods, notably the unconquered sun. Constantine gradually came to see himself as having a quasi-sacerdotal role, and this was of the first importance in the further evolution of the imperial office. He saw himself as responsible to God for the well-being of the church, to which he more and more publicly and unequivocally adhered. After 320 the sun no longer appeared on his coins and soldiers had to attend church parades. But he was always mindful of the susceptibilities of his pagan subjects. Though he later despoiled temples of their gold while building splendid Christian churches and encouraging converts by preferment, he did not cease to tolerate the old cults. In some of Constantine's work, like that of Diocletian, there was the development of things latent and implicit in the past, an extension of earlier precedents. This was true of his interventions in the internal affairs of the church. As early as 272, the Christians of Antioch had appealed to the emperor to remove a bishop, and in 316 Constantine himself tried to settle a controversy in North Africa by installing a bishop of Carthage against the will of a local sectarian group known as Donatists. Constantine came to believe that the emperor owed to God more than a grant of freedom to the church or even an endowment. His conception of his role evolved towards that of the guarantor and, if need be, the imposer of the unity which God required as the price of his continuing favor. When he turned on the Donatists, it was this view of his duty which gave them the unhappy distinction of being the first schismatics to be persecuted by a Christian government. Constantine was the creator of Caesaropapism, the belief that the secular ruler has divine authority to settle religious belief, and of the notion of established religion in Europe for the next 1,000 years. Constantine's greatest act in the ordering of religion came just after he had formally declared himself a Christian in 324, a declaration preceded by another victory over an imperial rival who had, interestingly, been persecuting Christians. This was the calling of the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea. It met for the first time in 325, nearly 300 bishops being present, and Constantine presided over it. Its task was to settle the response of the Church to a new heresy, Arianism, whose founder, Arius, taught that the Son did not share the divinity of the Father. Though technical and theological, the issues to which this gave rise prompted enormous controversy. Grave scandal was alleged by Arius's opponents. Constantine sought to heal the division, and the council laid down a creed which decided against the Arians, but went on in a second reunion to readmit Arius to communion after suitable declarations. That this did not satisfy all the bishops, and that there were few from the West at Nicaea, was less important than that Constantine had presided at this crucial juncture, proclaiming the emperor's enjoyment of special authority and responsibility. The Church was clothed in the imperial purple. There were other great implications, too. Behind the hair-splitting of the theologians lay a great question both of practice and principle, in the new ideological unity given to the empire by the official establishment of Christianity. What was to be the place of diverging Christian traditions, which were social and political, as well as liturgical and theological, realities? The churches of Syria and Egypt, for example, were strongly tinctured by their inheritance of thought and custom both from the Hellenistic culture and the popular religion of those regions. The importance of such considerations helps to explain why the practical outcome of Constantine's ecclesiastical policy was less than he had hoped. The council did not produce an emollient formula to make easier a general reconciliation in a spirit of compromise. Constantine's own attitude to the Arians soon relaxed. In the end, it was to be an Arian bishop who baptized him as he lay dying, but the opponents of Arius, led by the formidable Athanasius, bishop of Alexandria, were relentless. The quarrel remained unsettled when Arius died, and Constantine's own death followed not long after. Yet Arianism was not to prosper in the East. Its last successes, instead, were won by Arian missionaries to the Germanic tribes of southeast Russia. Born by these barbarian nations, Arianism was to survive until the 7th century in the West. How much of the Church's rise was in the end inevitable it is hardly profitable to consider. Certainly, in spite of a North African Christian tradition which saw the state as an irrelevance, something so positively important as Christianity could hardly have remained forever unrecognized by the civil power. Yet someone had to begin. Constantine was the man who took the crucial steps which linked church and empire for so long as the empire should last. His choices were historically decisive. The church gained most, for it acquired the charisma of Rome. The empire seemed less changed. Yet Constantine's sons were brought up as Christians, and even if the fragility of much in the new establishment was to appear soon after his death in 337, he had registered a decisive break with the tradition of classical Rome. Ultimately, unwittingly, he founded Christian Europe and, therefore, the modern world. One of his decisions only slightly less enduring in its effects was his foundation, on the command of God, he said, of a city to rival Rome on the site of the old Greek colony of Byzantium at the entrance to the Black Sea. It was dedicated in 330 as Constantinople. Though his own court remained at Nicomedia and no emperor was to reside there permanently for another 50 years, Constantine was again shaping the future. For 1,000 years Constantinople would be a Christian capital, unsullied by pagan rites. After that, for 500 years more, it would be a Muslim capital and the constant ambition of would-be successors to its traditions. Once again, though, this is anticipating too much. We must return to the empire as Constantine left it, in Roman eyes still coterminous with civilization. Its frontiers ran for the most part along natural features which recognized, more or less, the demarcations of distinct geographical or historical regions. Hadrian's Wall in Britannia was their northern limit. In continental Europe they followed the Rhine and Danube. The Black Sea coasts north of the mouth of the Danube had been lost to barbarians by 305 BC, but Asia Minor remained in the empire. It stretched as far east as the shifting boundary with Persia. Further south, the Levant coast and Palestine lay within a frontier which ran to the Red Sea. The Lower Nile Valley was still held by the empire, and so was the North African coast. The African frontiers were the Atlas Mountains and the desert. This unity was, for all Constantine's great work, in large measure an illusion. As the first experiments with co-emperors had shown, the world of Roman civilization had grown too big for a unified political structure, however desirable the preservation of the myth of unity might be. Growing cultural differentiation between a Greek-speaking East and a Latin-speaking West, the new importance of Asia Minor, Syria and Egypt, in all of which there were large Christian communities, after the establishment of Christianity, and the continuing stimulus of direct contact with Asia in the East, all drove the point home. After 364 the two parts of the old empire were only once more, and then only briefly, ruled by the same man. Their institutions diverged further and further. In the East the emperor was a theological as well as a juridical figure. The identity of empire and Christendom and the emperor's standing as the expression of divine intention were unambiguous. The West, on the other hand, had by 400 already seen foreshadowed the distinction of the roles of church and state, which was to father one of the most creative arguments of European politics. There was an economic contrast, too. The East was populous and could still raise great revenues, while the West was by 300 unable to feed itself without Africa and the Mediterranean islands. It now seems obvious that two distinct civilizations were to emerge, but it was a long time before any of the participants could see that. Instead, they saw something much more appalling: the Western Empire simply disappeared. By 500, when the boundaries of the Eastern Empire were still much what they had been under Constantine, and his successors were still holding their own against the Persians, the last Western emperor had been deposed and his insignia sent to Constantinople by a barbarian king who claimed to rule as the Eastern emperor's representative in the West. This is striking. What, actually, had collapsed? What had declined or fallen? 5th-century writers bewailed it so much that it is easy to have the impression, heightened by such dramatic episodes as sackings of Rome itself, that the whole of society fell apart. This was not so. It was the state apparatus which collapsed, some of its functions ceasing to be carried out and some passing into other hands. This was quite enough to explain the alarm. Institutions with 1,000 years of history behind them gave way within half a century. It is hardly surprising that people have asked why ever since. One explanation is cumulative. The state apparatus in the West gradually seized up after the recovery of the 4th century. The whole concern became too big for the demographic, fiscal and economic base which carried it. The main purpose of raising revenue was to pay for the military machine, but it became more and more difficult to raise enough. There were no more conquests after Dacia to bring in new tribute. Soon the measures adopted to squeeze out more taxes drove rich and poor alike to devices for avoiding them. The effect was to make agricultural estates rely more and more upon meeting their own needs and to become self-supporting, rather than producing for the market. Parallel with this went a crumbling of urban government as trade languished and the rich withdrew to the countryside. The military result was an army recruited from inferior material, because better troops could not be paid for. Even the reform of dividing it into mobile and garrison forces had its defects, for the first lost their fighting spirit by being stationed at the imperial residence and becoming used to the pampering and privileges that went with city postings, while the second turned into settled colonists, unwilling to take risks which would jeopardize their homesteads. Another descent in the unending spiral of decline logically followed. A weaker army drove the empire to rely still more on the very barbarians the army was supposed to keep at bay. As they had to be recruited as mercenaries, soothing and conciliatory politics were needed to keep them sweet. This led the Romans to concede more to the barbarians just when the pressure of the Germanic folk movements was reaching a new climax. Migration and the attractive prospect of paid service with the empire probably counted for much more in the barbarian contribution to imperial collapse than the simple desire for loot. The prospect of booty might animate a raiding party but could hardly bring down an empire. At the beginning of the 4th century, Germanic peoples were stretched along the whole length of the frontier from the Rhine to the Black Sea. Those who had lived nearest the regions of Roman expansion since the 1st century had drawn significantly on the development experience of the empire. The Romans may still have seen them as barbarians, but if so, they were barbarians with new models of organization, new technologies and new weapons, drawing on 400 years of development through trade and cultural diffusion along the Roman frontiers. Many of them must also have felt that they had suffered centuries of Rome's willful military aggression. It was in the south that the most formidable concentration was at that moment assembled. These were the Gothic peoples, Ostrogoth and Visigoth, who waited beyond the Danube. Some of them were already Christian, though in the Arian form. Together with Vandals, Burgundians and Lombards, they made up an East Germanic group. To the north were the West Germans, Franks, Alemanni, Saxons, Frisians and Thuringians. They would move into action in the second phase of the Völkerwanderung of the 4th and 5th centuries. The crisis began in the last quarter of the 4th century. The pressure of the Huns, a formidable nomadic people from Central Asia, on barbarians further west was mounting after 370. They overran the Ostrogothic territory, defeated the Alans, an Iranian-speaking tribe who had arrived there in the previous century, and then turned on the Visigoths near the Dniester. Unable to hold them, the Visigoths fled for refuge to the empire. In 376 they were allowed to cross the Danube to settle within the frontier. This was a new departure. Earlier barbarian incursions had been driven out or absorbed. Roman ways had attracted barbarian rulers and their followers had joined Rome's army. The Visigoths, though, came as a people, perhaps 40,000 strong, keeping their own laws and religion and remaining a compact unit. The Emperor Valens intended to disarm them. It was not done and instead there was fighting. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 the emperor was killed and a Roman army defeated by the Visigoth cavalry. The Visigoths ravaged Thrace. This was in more than one way a turning point. Now whole tribes began to be enrolled as confederates, foederati, and entered Roman territory to serve against other barbarians under their own chiefs. Large groups of Vandals and Alans crossed the Rhine in 406 and could not be driven back. A temporary settlement with the Visigoths could not be maintained. The Eastern Empire was helpless to protect its European territories outside Constantinople, though when the Visigothic armies moved north towards Italy early in the 5th century, they were checked for a while by a Vandal general. By now the defense of Italy, the old heart of the empire, was entirely dependent on barbarian auxiliaries and soon even this was not enough. Constantinople might be held, but in 410 the Goths sacked Rome. After an abortive move to the south, with a view to pillaging Africa as they had pillaged Italy, the Visigoths again turned north, crossed the Alps into Gaul and eventually settled as the new Kingdom of Toulouse in 419, a Gothic state within the empire, where a Gothic aristocracy shared its overlordship with the old Gallo-Roman landlords. These are confused events, difficult to follow, but there is still one other major movement of peoples which has to be noticed in order to explain the 5th century remaking of the European racial and cultural map. In return for their settlement in Aquitania, the Western Emperor had succeeded in getting the Visigoths to promise that they would help him to clear Spain of other outsiders. Of these the most important were the Vandals, an Eastern Germanic tribe from the Baltic coasts. In 406 the Rhine frontier, denuded of soldiers sent to defend Italy against the Visigoths, had given way to and the Vandals and Iranian-speaking Alans had broken into Gaul. From there they made their way southwards, sacking and looting as they went and crossing the Pyrenees to establish a Vandal state in Spain. 20 years later they were tempted to Africa by a dissident Roman governor who wanted their help. Visigoth attacks encouraged them to leave Spain. By 439 they had taken Carthage. The Vandal kingdom of Africa now had a naval base. They were to stay there for nearly a century, and in 455 they, too, crossed to sack Rome and leave their name to history as a synonym for mindless destructiveness. Terrible as this was, it was less important than the seizure of Africa, the mortal blow to the old Western Empire. It had now lost much of its economic base. Though great efforts could and would still be made in the West by Eastern emperors, Roman rule there was on its last legs. Even in 402, the Western Emperor and the Senate had already fled from Rome to Ravenna, the last imperial capital in Italy. The dependence on barbarian against barbarian was a fatal handicap. The cumulative impact of fresh pressure made recovery impossible. The protection of Italy had meant abandoning Gaul and Spain to the Vandals. Their invasion of Africa had meant the loss of Rome's grain-growing provinces. The collapse was completed in Europe in the third quarter of the century. It followed the greatest of the Hun assaults. These nomads had helped push the Germanic tribes into the Balkans and Central Europe after a preliminary diversion to ravage Anatolia and Syria. By 440 the Huns were led by Attila, under whom their power was at its height. From Hungary, where the Great Steppe Corridor of Asia peters out, he drove west for the last time with a huge army of allies, but was defeated near Troyes in 451 by a Roman army of Visigoths under a commander of barbarian origin. This was the end of the Hun threat. Attila died 2 years later, apparently scheming to marry the Western Emperor's sister and perhaps become emperor himself. A great revolt the following year by the Hun subjects in Hungary finally broke them, and they are thenceforth almost lost to sight. In Central Eurasia, their home, new confederations of nomads were forming to play a similar part in the future, but their story can wait. The Huns had all but delivered the coup de grace in the West. One emperor had sent the Pope to intercede with Attila. The last Western emperor was deposed by a Germanic warlord, Odoacer, in 476, and formal sovereignty passed to the Eastern emperors. Though Italy, like the rest of the former Western provinces, was henceforth a barbarian kingdom, independent in all but name, Italians regarded the emperor as their sovereign, resident in Constantinople though he might be. The rest of Western Europe was becoming Central Eurasianized. People, customs and concepts that had been developed on the Central Eurasian steppe were part of the foundation for the new kingdoms that emerged, either through peoples such as the Goths, Alans and Huns, or through the influence they had had on the Germanic tribes who had encountered them. It was a new world for those who lived on the continent. The structure which had finally given way under these blows has in its last decades something of the Cheshire Cat about it. It was fading away all the time. It is not particularly meaningful to pick one date rather than another as its end. It is unlikely that 476 seemed especially remarkable to contemporaries. The barbarian kingdoms were only a logical development of the reliance upon barbarian troops for the field army and their settlement as foederati within the frontiers. The barbarians themselves usually wanted no more, unless it was simple loot. Certainly they did not plan to replace imperial authority with their own. It is a Goth who is reported saying, "I hope to go down to posterity as the restorer of Rome, since it is not possible that I should be its supplanter." Other dangers were greater and more fundamental than barbarian swagger. Socially and economically, the tale of the 3rd century had been resumed in the 5th. Cities decayed and population fell. The civil service slid deeper into disorder as officials sought to protect themselves against inflation by taking payment for carrying out their duties. Though revenue declined as provinces were lost, the sale of offices somehow kept up the lavish expenditure of the court. But independence of action was gone. From being emperors whose power rested on their armies, the last emperors of the West declined through the stage of being the equals in negotiation with barbarian warlords whom they had to placate, to being their puppets, cooped up in the last imperial capital, Ravenna. Contemporaries had been right in this sense to see the sack of Rome in 410 as the end of an age, for then it was revealed that the empire could no longer preserve the very heart of Roman eaters. By then, there had been many other signs, too, of what was going on. The last emperor of Constantine's house had tried during a brief reign, 361–3, to restore the pagan cults. This had earned him historical fame, or, in Christian eyes, infamy, and, revealingly, the title the apostate, but he was not successful. Believing that a restoration of the old sacrifices would ensure the return of prosperity, he had too little time to test the proposition. What is now perhaps more striking is the unquestioned assumption that religion and public life were inseparably intertwined, on which his policy was based and which commanded general agreement. It was an assumption whose origins were Roman, not Christian. Julian did not threaten Constantine's work, and Theodosius, the last ruler of a united empire, at last forbade the public worship of the ancient gods in 380. What this meant in practice is hard to say. In Egypt it seems to have been the final landmark in the process of overcoming the ancient civilization which had been going on for 8 centuries or so. The victory of Greek ideas first won by the philosophers of Alexandria was now confirmed by the Christian clergy. The priests of the ancient cults were to be harried as pagans. Roman paganism found outspoken defenders still in the 5th century, and only at the end of it were pagan teachers expelled from the universities at Athens and Constantinople. Nonetheless, a great turning point had been reached. In principle, the closed Christian society of the Middle Ages was now in existence. Christian emperors soon set about developing it in a particular direction, which became only too familiar, by depriving Jews, the most easily identifiable of groups alien to the closed society, of their juridical equality with other citizens. Here was another turning point. Judaism had long been the only monotheistic representative in the pluralistic religious world of Rome, and now it was ousted by its derivative, Christianity. A prohibition on proselytizing was the first blow, and others soon followed. In 425 the Patriarchate, under which Jews had enjoyed administrative autonomy, was abolished. When pogroms occurred, Jews began to withdraw to Persian territory. Their growing alienation from the empire weakened it, for they could soon call upon Rome's enemies for help. Jewish Arab states which lay along trade routes to Asia through the Red Sea were able to inflict damage on Roman interests in support of their co-religionists too. Ideological rigor came at a high price. Theodosius's reign is also notable in Christian history because of his quarrel with Saint Ambrose, Bishop of Milan. In 390, after an insurrection at Thessalonica, Theodosius pitilessly massacred thousands of its inhabitants. To the amazement of contemporaries, the emperor was soon seen standing in penance for the deed in a Milan church. Ambrose had refused him communion. Superstition had won the first round of what was to prove a long battle for humanity and enlightenment. Other men of might were to be tamed by excommunication or its threat, but this was the first time the spiritual arm had been so exercised, and it is significant that it happened in the Western Church. Ambrose had alleged a higher duty for his office than that owed to the emperor. It is the inauguration of a great theme of Western European history, the tension of spiritual and secular claims, which was time and time again to pull it back into a progressive channel, the conflict of church and state. By then, a glorious century for Christianity was almost over. It had been a great age of evangelization, in which missionaries had penetrated as far afield as Ethiopia, a brilliant age of theology and, above all, the age of establishment. Yet the Christianity of the age has about it much which now seems repellent. Establishment gave Christians power they did not hesitate to use. "We look on the same stars, the same heavens are above us all," pleaded one pagan to Saint Ambrose, "the same universe surrounds us. What matters it by what method each of us arrives at the truth?" But Symmachus asked in vain. East and West, the temper of the Christian churches was intransigent and enthusiastic. If there was a distinction between the two, it lay between the Greeks' conviction of the almost limitless authority of a Christianized empire, blending spiritual and secular power, and the defensive, suspicious hostility to the whole secular world, state included, of a Latin tradition which taught Christians to see themselves as a saving remnant, tossed on the seas of sin and paganism in the Noah's Ark of the Church. Yet to be fair to the Church Fathers, or to understand their anxieties and fears, a modern observer has to recognize the compelling power of superstition and mystery in the whole late classical world. Christianity acknowledged and expressed it. The demons among whom Christians walked their earthly ways were real to them and to pagans alike, and a 5th-century pope consulted the augurs in order to find out what to do about the Goths. This is part of the explanation of the bitterness with which heresy and schism were pursued. Arianism had not been finished off at Nicaea. It flourished among the Gothic peoples, and Arian Christianity was dominant over much of Italy, Gaul and Spain. The Catholic Church was not persecuted in the Arian Barbarian Kingdoms, but it was neglected there, and when everything depended on the patronage of rulers and the great, neglect could be dangerous. Another threat was the Donatist schism in Africa, which had taken on a social content and broke out in violent conflicts of town and country. In Africa, too, the old threat of Gnosticism lived again in Manichaeism, which came to the west from Persia. Another heresy, Pelagianism, showed the readiness of some Christians in Latinized Europe to welcome a version of Christianity which subordinated mystery and sacramentalism to the aim of living a good life. Few men were better fitted by temperament or education to discern, analyze and combat such dangers than was Saint Augustine, the greatest of the Church Fathers. It was important that he came from Africa, that is to say, the Roman province of that name, which corresponded roughly to Tunisia and eastern Algeria, where he was born in 354. African Christianity had more than a century's life behind it by then, but was still a minority affair. The African Church had a special temper of its own since the days of Tertullian, its great founding figure. Its roots did not lie in the Hellenized cities of the East, but in soil laid down by the religions of Carthage and Numidia, which lingered on amid the Berber peasantry. The humanized deities of Olympus had never been at home in Africa. The local traditions were of remote gods dwelling in mountains and high places, worshipped in savage and ecstatic rituals. The Carthaginians are supposed to have practiced child sacrifice. The intransigent, violent temper of the African Christianity which grew up against this background was reflected to the full in Augustine's own personality. He responded to the same psychological stimuli and felt the need to confront the fact of an evil lurking in himself. One answer was available and popular. The stark dualism of Manichaeism had a very wide appeal in Africa. Augustine was a Manichae for nearly 10 years. Characteristically, he then reacted against his errors with great violence. Before adulthood and Manichaeism, Augustine's education had orientated him towards a public career in the Western Empire. That education was overwhelmingly Latin. Augustine probably spoke only that language and certainly found Greek difficult, and very selective. Its skills were those of rhetoric, and it was in them that Augustine first won prizes, but as for ideas, it was barren. Augustine taught himself by reading. His first great step forward was the discovery of the works of Cicero, probably his first contact, though at second hand, with the classical Greco-Roman tradition. Augustine's lay career ended in Milan, where he had gone to teach rhetoric, with his baptism as a Catholic by Saint Ambrose himself in 387. At that time Ambrose exercised an authority which rivaled that of the empire itself in one of its most important cities. Augustine's observation of this relation between religion and secular power confirmed him in views very different from those of Greek churchmen, who welcomed the conflation of lay and religious authority in the emperor which followed establishment. Augustine then returned to Africa, first to live as a monk at Hippo and then, reluctantly, to become its bishop. There he remained until his death in 430, building up Catholicism's position against the Donatists and almost by the way, thanks to vast correspondence and a huge literary output, becoming a dominant personality of the Western Church. In his lifetime Augustine was best known for his attacks on the Donatists and the Pelagians. The first was really a political question: which of two rival churches was to dominate Roman Africa? The second raised wider issues. They must seem remote to our non-theologically minded age, but on them turned much future European history. Essentially, the Pelagians preached a kind of Stoicism. They were part of the classical world and tradition, dressed up in Christian theological language though it might be. The danger this presented, if it was a danger, was that the distinctiveness of Christianity would be lost and the Church simply become the vehicle of one strain of belief in classical Mediterranean civilization, with the strengths and weaknesses which that implied. Augustine was uncompromisingly otherworldly and theological. For him the only possibility of redemption for mankind lay in the grace that God conferred and no man could command by his works. In the history of the human spirit, Augustine deserves a place for having laid out more comprehensively than any predecessor the lines of the great debate between predestination and free will, grace and works, belief and motive, which was to run for so long through European history. Almost incidentally, he established Latin Christianity firmly on the rock of the Church's unique power of access to the source of grace through the sacraments. This is now largely forgotten except by specialists. Saint Augustine, as he came to be, now enjoys instead some notoriety as one of the most forceful and insistent exponents of a distrust of the flesh which was especially to mark Christian sexual attitudes and thereby the whole of Western culture. He stands in strange company, with Plato, for example, as a founding father of Puritanism. But his intellectual legacy was far richer than this suggests. In his writings can also be seen the foundations of much medieval political thinking, insofar as they are not Aristotelian or legalistic, and a view of history which would long dominate Christian society in the West and would affect it as importantly as the words of Christ himself. The book now called The City of God contains the writing of Augustine which had most future impact. It is not so much a matter of specific ideas or doctrines. There is difficulty in locating his precise influence on medieval political thinkers, perhaps because there is much ambiguity about what he says, as of an attitude. He laid out in this book a way of looking at history and the government of men which became inseparable from Christian thinking for 1,000 years and more. The subtitle of the book is Against the Pagans. This reveals his aim, to refute the reactionary and pagan charge that the troubles crowding in on the empire were to be blamed on Christianity. He was inspired to write by the Gothic sack of Rome in 410. His overriding aim was to demonstrate that the understanding of even such an appalling event was possible for a Christian and, indeed, could only be understood through the Christian religion. But his huge book swoops far and wide, from the importance of chastity to the philosophy of Thales of Miletus, and expounds the civil wars of Marius and Sulla as carefully as the meaning of God's promises to David. It is impossible to summarize. It may be too much for some, too little for others, said Augustine Riley in his last paragraph. It is a Christian interpretation of a whole civilization and what went into its making. Its most remarkable feature is its own central judgment, that the whole earthly tissue of things is dispensable, and culture and institutions, even the great empire itself, of no final value, if God so wills. That God did so will was suggested by Augustine's central image of two cities. One was earthly, founded in men's lower nature, imperfect and made with sinful hands, however glorious its appearance and however important the part it might from time to time have to play in the divine scheme. Sometimes its sinful aspect predominates and it is clear that men must flee the earthly city, but Babylon, too, had had its part in the divine plan. The other city was the heavenly city of God, the community founded on the assurance of God's promise of salvation, a goal towards which mankind might make a fearful pilgrimage from the earthly city, led and inspired by the Church. In the Church was to be found both the symbol of the city of God and the means of reaching it. History had changed with the appearance of the Church. From that moment the struggle of good and evil was clear in the world and human salvation rested upon its defense. Such arguments would be heard long into modern times. The two cities make other appearances in Augustine's argument too. They are sometimes two groups of men, those who are condemned to punishment in the next world and those who are making the pilgrimage to glory. At this level the cities are divisions of the actual human race, here and now, as well as of all those since Adam who have already passed to judgment. But Augustine did not think that membership of the Church explicitly defines one group, the rest of humanity being the other. Perhaps the power of Augustine's vision was all the greater because of its ambiguities, dangling threads of argument and suggestion. The state was not merely earthly and wicked, it had its role in the divine scheme, and government, in its nature, was divinely given. Much was later to be heard about that. The state would be asked to serve the Church by preserving it from its carnal enemies and by using its own power to enforce the purity of the faith. Yet the mandate of heaven, as another civilization might put it, could be withdrawn and when it was, even an event like the sack of Rome was only a landmark in the working of judgment on sin. In the end the city of God would prevail. Saint Augustine escapes simple definition in his greatest book, but perhaps he escapes it in every sense. Much remains to be said about him for which there is little room here. He was, for example, a careful and conscientious bishop, the loving pastor of his flock. He was also a persecutor with the dubious distinction of having persuaded the imperial government to use force against the Donatists. He wrote a fascinating spiritual study which, though profoundly misleading on the facts of his early life, virtually founded the literary genre of romantic and introspective autobiography. He could be an artist with words, Latin ones, not Greek. He had to ask Saint Jerome for help with Greek translation, and was a prize-winning scholar, but his artistry was born of passion rather than of craftsmanship, and his Latin is often poor. Yet he was soaked in the classical Roman past. It was from the high ground of his mastery of this tradition that he looked out with the eyes of Christian faith to a cloudy, uncertain and, to other men, frightening future. He embodied two cultures more completely, perhaps, than any other man of those divided times, and perhaps this is why, 1,500 years later, he still seems to dominate them. In the Germanic invasions lie the origins of the first nations of modern Europe, though when the Western Empire disappeared, the barbarian peoples did not occupy areas that looked much like later states. They fall clearly into four major and distinctive groups. The northernmost, the Saxons, Angles and Jutes, were moving into the old Roman province of Britannia from the 4th century onwards, settling there well before the island was abandoned to its inhabitants when the last emperor to be proclaimed there by his soldiers crossed with his army to Gaul in 407. Britain was then contested between successive bands of invaders and the Romano-British inhabitants until there emerged from it at the beginning of the 7th century a group of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fringed by a Celtic world consisting of Ireland, Wales and Scotland. Though the first British still lived on in communities which seemed to have survived sometimes to the 10th century, and perhaps longer, Romano-British civilization disappeared more completely than its equivalents anywhere else in the Western Empire. Even the language was to go, a Germanic tongue almost completely replaced it. We may have a fleeting glimpse of the last spasms of Romano-British resistance in the legend of King Arthur and his knights, which could be a reminiscence of the cavalry fighting skills of the late imperial army, but that is all. Of administrative or cultural continuity between this imperial province and the barbarian kingdoms there is virtually no trace. The imperial heritage of the future England was purely physical. It lay in the ruins of towns and villas, occasional Christian crosses, or the great constructions like Hadrian's Wall which were to puzzle newcomers until they came at last to believe that they were the work of giants of superhuman power. Some of these relics, like the complex of baths built upon the thermal springs at Bath, disappeared from sight for hundreds of years until rediscovered by the antiquaries of the 18th and 19th centuries. The roads remained, sometimes serving for centuries as trade routes even when their engineering had succumbed to time, weather and pillage. Finally, there were the natural immigrants who had come with the Romans and stayed, animals such as the ferret, or plants such as the mustard which was to spice the roast beef that became a minor national mythology over 1,000 years later. But of the things of the mind left by the Romans we have hardly a trace. Romano-British Christianity, whatever it may have been, disappeared and the keepers of the faith retired for a time to the misty fastnesses where there brooded the monks of the Celtic Church. It was another Rome which was to convert the English nation, not the empire. Before that, Germanic tradition would be the preponderant formative influence as nowhere else within the old imperial territory. Across the Channel, things were very different. Much survived. After its devastation by the Vandals, Gaul continued to lie in the shadow of the Visigoths of Aquitaine. Their share in repelling the Huns gave them greater importance than ever. To the northeast of Gaul, nevertheless, lay German tribes which were to displace them from this superiority, the Franks. Unlike the Visigoths, the Franks had not been converted by Arian clergy, in part because of this, the future was to belong to them. They were to have a bigger impact on the shaping of Europe than any other barbarian people. The graves of the first Franks reveal a warrior society divided into a hierarchy of ranks. More willing to settle than some other barbarians, they were established in the 4th century in modern Belgium, between the Scheldt and the Meuse, where they became Roman foederati. Some of them moved on into Gaul. One group, settled at Tournai, threw up a ruling family subsequently called Merovingians. The third king, if this is the correct word, of this line was Clovis. His is the first great name in the history of the country known as Francia after the peoples which Clovis brought together. Clovis became ruler of the Western Franks in 481. Though formerly the subject of the emperor, he soon turned on the last Roman governors of Gaul and conquered lands far to the west and down to the Loire. Meanwhile the Eastern Franks defeated the Alemanni, and when Clovis had been elected their king, too, a Frankish realm straddled the lower Rhine valley and northern France. This was the heartland of the Frankish state which in due course appeared as the heir to Roman supremacy in North Europe. Clovis married a princess from another Germanic people, the Burgundians, who had settled in the Rhone valley and the area running southeast to modern Geneva and Besançon. She was a Catholic, though her people were Arians, and at some time after their marriage, traditionally in 496, and after a battlefield conversion reminiscent of Constantine's, Clovis himself embraced Catholicism. This gave him the support of the Roman Church, the most important power still surviving from the empire in the barbarian lands, in what it now chose to regard as a religious war against the other Germanic peoples of Gaul. Catholicism was also the way to friendship with the Romano-Gallic population. No doubt the conversion was political, it was also momentous. A new Rome was to rule in Gaul. The Burgundians were Clovis's first victims, though they were not subjugated completely until after his death, when they were given Merovingian princes but kept an independent state structure. The Visigoths were tackled next. They were left only the southeastern territories they held north of the Pyrenees, the later Languedoc, Roussillon and Provence. Clovis was now the successor of the Romans in all Gaul. The emperor recognized it by naming him a consul. The Frankish capital was moved to Paris by Clovis, and he was buried in the church he had built there, the first Frankish king not to be buried as a barbarian. But this was not the start of the continuous history of Paris as a capital. A Germanic kingdom was not what later times would think of as a state, nor what a Roman would recognize. It was a heritage composed partly of lands, partly of kinship groups. Clovis's heritage was divided among his sons, and the Frankish kingdom was not reunited until 558. A couple of years later it broke up again. Gradually, it settled down into three portions. One was Austrasia, with its capital at Metz and its center of gravity east of the Rhine. Neustria was the western equivalent and had its capital at Soissons, under the same ruler, but distinct was the Kingdom of Burgundy. Their rulers tended to quarrel over the lands where these regions touched. In this structure there begins to appear a Frankish nation, no longer a collection of barbarian war bands but peoples belonging to a recognizable state, speaking a Latin vernacular, and with an emerging class of landowning nobles. Significantly, from it there also comes a Christian interpretation of the barbarian role in history, the history of the Franks by Gregory, Bishop of Tours, himself from the Romano-Gallic aristocracy. Other barbarian peoples would produce similar works. The greatest, perhaps, is that written for England by the Venerable Bede, which sought to reconcile traditions in which paganism was still strong to Christianity and the civilized heritage. It must be said that Gregory presented a picture of the Franks after the death of his hero Clovis which was pessimistic. He thought the Frankish rulers had behaved so badly that their kingdom was doomed. The Merovingians kept other barbarians out of Gaul, and took their lands north of the Alps from the Ostrogoths, where their greatest king was Theodoric. His right to rule in Italy, where he fought off other Germans, was recognized by the emperor in 497. He was utterly convinced of Rome's authority. He had an emperor as godfather and had been brought up at Constantinople until he was 18. "Our royalty is an imitation of yours, a copy of the only empire on earth," he once wrote to the emperor in Constantinople from his capital in Ravenna. On his coins appeared the legend Unvanquished Rome, Romone Victor. And when he went to Rome, Theodoric held games in the old style in the circus. Yet technically he was the only Ostrogoth who was a Roman citizen. His personal authority was accepted by the Senate, but his countrymen were merely the mercenary soldiers of the empire. To civil offices he appointed Romans. One of them was his friend and advisor, the philosopher Boethius, who was to be possibly the most important single thinker through whom the legacy of the classical world passed to medieval Europe. Theodoric seems to have been a judicious ruler, maintaining good relations with other barbarian peoples. He married Clovis's sister, and enjoying some sort of primacy among them. But he did not share his own people's Arian faith, and religious division told against Ostrogothic power in the long run. Unlike the Franks, and in spite of their ruler's example, they were not to ally with the Roman past, and after Theodoric the Ostrogoths were expelled from Italy and history by generals from the Eastern Empire. They left a ruined Italy, soon to be invaded by yet another outside people, the Lombards. In the west, Clovis had left the Visigoths virtually confined to Spain, from which they had driven the Vandals. Other Germanic peoples were already settled there. Its terrain presented quite special problems, as it has continued to do to all invaders and governments, and the Visigothic kingdom of Spain was not able to resist much more Romanization than its founders had undergone in Gaul, where they had fused much less with existing society than had the Franks. The Visigoths, and there were not so very many of them, less than 100,000 at most, clustered about their leaders who spread out from Old Castile through the provinces. They then quarreled so much that imperial rule was able to re-establish itself for more than half a century in the south. Finally, the Visigothic kings turned to Catholicism and thus enlisted the authority of the Spanish bishops. In 587 begins the long tradition of Catholic monarchy in Spain. What this adds up to is hard to say. Generalization is hazardous. Simple duration alone almost explains this. The Visigoths underwent 3 centuries of evolution between the creation of the Kingdom of Toulouse and the end of their ascendancy in Spain. Much changed in so long a time. Though economic life and technology hardly altered except for the worse, mental and institutional forms were undergoing radical, if slow, transformations in all the barbarian kingdoms. Soon it is not quite right to think of them still as merely such, except, perhaps, the Lombards. The Germanic tribesmen were a minority, often isolated in alien settings, dependent on routines long established by the particular environment for their living and forced into some sort of understanding with the conquered. The passage of their invasions must sometimes have seemed at close quarters like a flood tide, but when it had passed there were often only tiny, isolated pools of invaders left behind, here and there replacing the Roman masters, but often living alongside them and with them. Marriage between Roman and barbarian was not legal until the 6th century, but that was not much of a check. In Gaul the Franks took up its Latin, adding Frankish words to it. By the 7th century, Western European society has already a very different atmosphere from that of the turbulent 5th. Nonetheless, a barbarian past left its imprint. In almost all the barbarian kingdoms society was long and irreversibly shaped by Germanic custom. This sanctioned a hierarchy reflected in the characteristic Germanic device for securing public order, the blood feud. Men, and women, and cattle, and property of all sorts, had in the most literal sense their price. Wrongs done were settled by interesting a whole clan or family in the outcome if customary compensation was not forthcoming. Kings more and more wrote down and thus in a sense published what such customs were. Literacy was so rare that there can have been no point in imagining devices such as the stele of Babylon or the whiteboards on which the decrees of Greek city-states were set out. Recording by a scribe on parchment for future consultation was the most that could be envisaged. Nonetheless, in this Germanic world lie the origins of a jurisprudence one day to be carried across oceans to new cultures of European stock. The first institution to open the way to this was the acceptance of kingly or collective power to declare what was to be recorded. All the Germanic kingdoms moved towards the writing down and codification of their law. Where the early forms of public action are not religious or supernatural, they are usually judicial, and it is hardly surprising that, for example, the Visigothic court of Toulouse should have sought the skills of Roman legal experts. But this was only one form of a respect which almost every barbarian aristocracy showed for Roman tradition and forms. Theodoric saw himself as the representative of the emperor. His problem did not lie in identifying his own role, but in the need to avoid irritating his followers who could be provoked by any excessive Romanization. Perhaps similar considerations weighed with Clovis before his conversion, which was an act of identification with empire as well as with church. At the level just below such heroic figures, both Frankish and Visigothic noblemen seem to have taken pleasure in showing themselves the heirs of Rome by writing to one another in Latin and patronizing light literature. There was a tie of interest with the Romans, too. Visigothic warriors sometimes found employment in putting down the revolts of peasants who menaced Romano-Gallic landowners as well as the invaders. Yet so long as Arianism stood in the way, there was a limit to the identification with Romanitas possible for the barbarians. The Church, after all, was the supreme relic of Empire west of Constantinople. The Eastern emperors had not seen these changes with indifference. But troubles in their own domains hamstrung them, and in the 5th century their barbarian generals dominated them too. They watched with apprehension the last years of the puppet emperors of Ravenna but recognized Odoacer, the deposer of the last of them. They maintained a formal claim to rule over a single empire, East and West, without actually questioning Odoacer's independence in Italy until an effective replacement was available in Theodoric, to whom the title of patrician was given. Meanwhile, Persian wars and the new pressure of Slavs in the Balkans were more than enough to deal with. It was not until the accession of Emperor Justinian in 527 that reality seemed likely to be restored to imperial government. In retrospect, Justinian seemed something of a failure. Yet he behaved as people thought an emperor should. He did what most people still expected that a strong emperor would one day do. He boasted that Latin was his native tongue. For all the wide sweep of the empire's foreign relations, he could still think plausibly of reuniting and restoring the old empire, centered on Constantinople though it now had to be. We labor under the handicap of knowing what happened, but he reigned a long time and his contemporaries were more struck by his temporary successes. They expected them to herald a real restoration. After all, no one could really conceive a world without the empire. The barbarian kings of the West gladly deferred to Constantinople and accepted titles from it. They did not grasp at the purple themselves. Justinian sought autocratic power, and his contemporaries found the goal both comprehensible and realistic. There is a certain grandeur about his conception of his role. It is a pity that he should have been so unattractive a man. Justinian was almost always at war. Often he was victorious. Even the costly Persian campaigns, and payments to the Persian king, were successful in the limited sense that they did not lose the empire much ground. Yet they were a grave strategic handicap, the liberation of his resources for a policy of recovery in the West, which had been Justinian's aim in his first peace with the Persians, always eluded him. Nevertheless, his greatest general, Belisarius, destroyed Vandal Africa and recovered that country for the empire, though it took 10 years to reduce it to order. He went on to invade Italy and begin the struggle which ended in 554 with the final eviction of the Ostrogoths from Rome and the unification once more of all Italy under imperial rule, albeit an Italy devastated by the imperial armies as it had never been by the barbarians. These were great achievements, though badly followed up. More were to follow in southern Spain, where the imperial armies exploited rivalry between Visigoths and again set up imperial government in Córdoba. Throughout the western Mediterranean, too, the imperial fleets were supreme. For a century after Justinian's death, Byzantine ships moved about unmolested. It did not last. By the end of the century most of Italy was gone again, this time to the Lombards, another Germanic people and the final extinguishers of imperial power in the peninsula. In Eastern Europe, too, in spite of a vigorous diplomacy of bribery and missionary ideology, Justinian had never been successful in dealing with the barbarians. Perhaps enduring success there was impossible. The pressure from behind on these migrant peoples was too great and, besides, they could see great prizes ahead. The barbarians, wrote one historian of the reign, having once tasted Roman wealth, never forgot the road that led to it. By Justinian's death, in spite of his expensive fortress building, the ancestors of the later Bulgars were settled in Thrace and a wedge of barbarian peoples separated West and East Rome. Justinian's conquests, great as they were, could not be maintained by his successors in the face of the continuing threat from Persia, the rise of Slav pressure in the Balkans and, in the 7th century, of a new rival, Islam. A terrible time lay ahead. Yet even then Justinian's legacy would be operative through the diplomatic tradition he founded, the building of a network of influence among the barbarian peoples beyond the frontier, playing off one against another, bribing one prince with tribute or a title, standing godparent to the baptized children of another. If it had not been for the client princedoms of the Caucasus who were converted to Christianity in Justinian's day, or his alliance with the Crimean Goths, which was to last 7 centuries, the survival of the Eastern Empire would have been almost impossible. In this sense, too, the reign sets out the ground plan of a future Byzantine sphere. Within the empire, Justinian left an indelible imprint. At his accession the monarchy was handicapped by the persistence of party rivalries which could draw upon popular support, but in 532 this led to a great insurrection which made it possible to strike at the factions and, though much of the city was burnt, this was the end of domestic threats to Justinian's autocracy. It showed itself henceforth more and more consistently and nakedly. Its material monuments were lavish, the greatest is the Basilica of Saint Sophia itself, 532-7, but all over the empire public buildings, churches, baths and new towns mark the reign and speak for the inherent wealth of the Eastern Empire. The richest and most civilized provinces were in Asia and Egypt, Alexandria, and Beirut were their great cities. A non-material, institutional monument of the reign was Justinian's codification of Roman law. In 4 collections 1,000 years of Roman jurisprudence was put together in a form which gave it huge influence across the centuries and helped to shape the modern idea of the state. Justinian's efforts to win administrative and organizational reforms were far less successful. It was not difficult to diagnose ills known to be dangerous as early as the 3rd century, but given the expense and responsibilities of empire, permanent remedies were hard to find. The sale of offices, for example, was known to be an evil and Justinian abolished it, but then had to tolerate it when the practice crept back into use. The main institutional response to the empire's problems was a progressive regimentation of its citizens. In part, this was in the tradition of regulating the economy which Justinian had inherited. Just as peasants were tied to the soil, craftsmen were now attached to their hereditary corporations and guilds, even the bureaucracy tended to become hereditary. The resulting rigidity was unlikely to make imperial problems easier to solve. It was unfortunate, too, that a quite exceptionally disastrous series of natural calamities fell on the East at the beginning of the 6th century. They go far to explain why it was hard for Justinian to leave the empire in better fettle than he found it. Earthquake, famine and plague devastated the cities and even the capital itself, where men saw phantoms in the streets. The ancient world was a credulous place, but tales of the emperor's capacity to take off his head and then put it on again, or to disappear from sight at will, suggest that under these strains the mental world of the Eastern Empire was already slipping its moorings in classical civilization. Justinian was to make the separation easier by his religious outlook and policies, another paradoxical outcome, for it was far from what he intended. After it had survived for 800 years, he abolished the Academy of Athens. He wanted to be a Christian emperor, not a ruler of unbelievers, and decreed the destruction of all pagan statues in the capital. Worse still, he accelerated the demotion of the Jews in civic status and the reduction of their freedom to exercise their religion. Things had already gone a long way by then. Pogroms had long been connived at and synagogues destroyed. Now Justinian went on to alter the Jewish calendar and interfere with the Jewish order of worship. He even encouraged barbarian rulers to persecute Jews. Long before the cities of Western Europe, Constantinople had a ghetto. Justinian was all the more confident of the rightness of asserting imperial authority in ecclesiastical affairs because he had a real taste for theological disputation. Sometimes the consequences were unfortunate. Such an attitude did nothing to renew the loyalty to the empire of the Nestorians and Monophysites, heretics who had refused to accept the definitions of the precise relationship of God the Father to God the Son laid down in 451 at a council at Chalcedon. The theology of such deviants mattered less than the fact that their symbolic tenets were increasingly identified with important linguistic and cultural groups. Harrying heretics intensified separatist feeling in parts of Egypt and Syria. In the former, the Coptic Church went its own way in opposition to orthodoxy in the later 5th century, and the Syrian Monophysites followed, setting up their own church. Both were encouraged and sustained by the numerous and enthusiastic monks of those countries. Some of these sects and communities, too, had important connections outside the empire, so that foreign policy was involved. The Nestorians found refuge in Persia and, though not heretics, the Jews were especially influential beyond the frontiers. Jews in Iraq supported Persian attacks on the empire, and Jewish Arab states in the area of the Red Sea interfered with the trade routes to India when hostile measures were taken against Jews in the empire. Justinian's hopes of reuniting the Western and Eastern churches were to be thwarted in spite of his zeal. A potential division between them had always existed because of the different cultural matrices in which each had been formed. The Western Church had never accepted the union of religious and secular authority, which was the heart of the political theory of the Eastern Empire. The empire would pass away as others had done, and the Bible told, and it would be the Church which would prevail against the gates of hell. Now such doctrinal divergences became more important, and separation had been made more likely by the breakdown in the West. A Roman pope visited Justinian, and the emperor spoke of Rome as the source of priesthood, but in the end 2 Christian communions were first to go their own ways and then violently to quarrel. Justinian's own view, that the emperor was supreme, even on matters of doctrine, fell victim to clerical intransigence on both sides. This seems to imply, as do so many others of his acts, that Justinian's real achievement was not that which he sought and temporarily achieved, the re-establishment of the imperial unity, but something quite different, the easing of the path towards the development of a new, Byzantine civilization. After him, it was a reality, even if not yet recognized. Byzantium was evolving away from the classical world towards a style clearly related to it, but independent of it. This was made easier by contemporary developments in both Eastern and Western culture, by now overwhelmingly a matter of new tendencies in the Church. As often in later history, the Church and its leaders had not at first recognized or welcomed an opportunity in disaster. They identified themselves with what was collapsing, and understandably so. The collapse of empire was for them the collapse of civilization. The Church in the West was, except for municipal authority in the impoverished towns, often the sole institutional survivor of Roman eaters. Its bishops were men with experience of administration, at least as likely as other local notables to be intellectually equipped to grapple with new problems. A semi-pagan population looked to them with superstitious awe and attributed to them near magical power. In many places they were the last embodiment of authority left when imperial armies went away and imperial administration crumbled, and they were lettered men among a new unlettered ruling class which craved the assurance of sharing the classical heritage. Socially, they were often drawn from the leading provincial families. That meant that they were sometimes great aristocrats and proprietors with material resources to support their spiritual role. Naturally, new tasks were thrust upon them. This was not all. The end of the classical world also saw 2 new institutions emerge in the Western Church which were to be lifelines in the dangerous rapids between a civilization which had collapsed and one yet to be born. The first was Christian monasticism, a phenomenon that first appeared in the East. It was in about 285 that a Copt, Saint Anthony, retired to a hermit's life in the Egyptian desert. His example was followed by others who watched, prayed and strove with demons or mortified the flesh by fasting and more dubious disciplines. Some of them drew together in communities and became monks within the confines of a monastery, a practice that soon spread from the east to the west. One Italian monk, of whom we know little except his achievement and that he was believed to work miracles, found the state of monasticism shocking. This was Saint Benedict, one of the most influential men in the Church's history. In 529 he set up a monastery at Monte Cassino in southern Italy, giving it a new rule which he had compiled by sifting and selecting among others available. It is a seminal document of Western Christianity and therefore of Western civilization. It directed the attention of the monk to the community, whose abbot was to have complete authority. The community's purpose was not merely to provide a hotbed for the cultivation or the salvation of individual souls, but that it should worship and live as a whole. The individual monk was to contribute to its task in the framework of an ordered routine of worship, prayer and labor. From the individualism of traditional monasticism a new human instrument was forged. It was to be one of the main weapons in the armory of the Church. Saint Benedict did not set his sights too high, and this was one secret of his success. The rule was within the powers of ordinary men who loved God, and his monks did not need to mutilate either body or spirit. Its success in estimating their need was demonstrated by its rapid spread. Very quickly Benedictine monasteries appeared everywhere in the West. They became the key sources of missionaries and teaching for the conversion of pagan England and Germany. In the West, only the Celtic Church at its fringe clung to the older, eremitical model of the monkish life. The Church's other new great support was the papacy. The prestige of St. Peter's See and the legendary guardianship of the Apostles' Bones always gave Rome a special place among the bishoprics of Christendom. It was the only one in the West to claim descent from one of the apostles. But in principle it had little else to offer. The Western Church was a junior branch, and it was in the churches of Asia that the closest links with the apostolic age could be asserted. Something more was required for the papacy to begin its rise to the splendid preeminence which was taken for granted by the medieval world. To begin with, there was the city. Rome had been seen for centuries as the capital of the world, and for much of the world that had been true. Its bishops were the business colleagues of Senate and Emperor, and the departure of the imperial court only left their eminence more obvious. The arrival in Italy of alien civil servants from the Eastern Empire, whom the Italians disliked as much as they did the barbarians, directed new attention to the papacy as the focus of Italian loyalties. It was, too, a wealthy see, with an apparatus of government commensurate with its possessions. It generated administrative skill superior to anything to be found outside the imperial administration itself. This distinction stood out all the more clearly in times of trouble, when the barbarians lacked these skills. The See of Rome had the finest records of any. Already in the 5th century papal apologists were exploiting them. The characteristically conservative papal stance, the argument that no new departures are being made but that old positions are being defended, is already present and was wholly sincere. Popes did not see themselves as conquerors of new ideological and legal ground, but as men desperately trying to keep the small foothold the Church had already won. This was the setting of the papacy's emergence as a great historical force. The 5th century Leo the Great was the first pope under whom the new power of the Bishop of Rome was clearly visible. An emperor declared papal decisions to have the force of law, and Leo vigorously asserted the doctrine that the popes spoke in the name of St. Peter. He assumed the title Pontifex Maximus, discarded by the emperors. It was believed that his intervention by visiting Attila had staved off the Hun attack on Italy. Bishops in the West who had hitherto resisted claims for Rome's primacy became more willing to accept them in a world turned upside down by barbarians. Still, though, Rome was a part of the state church of an empire whose religion Justinian saw as above all the emperor's concern. The pope in whom the future medieval papacy is most clearly revealed was also the first pope who had been a monk. In Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604, there thus came together the two great institutional innovations of the early Church. He was a statesman of great insight. A Roman aristocrat, loyal to the empire and respectful of the emperor, he was nevertheless the first pope who fully accepted the barbarian Europe in which he reigned. his pontificate at last reveals a complete break with the classical world. He saw as his duty the first great missionary campaign, one of whose targets was pagan England, to which he sent Augustine of Canterbury in 596. He struggled against the Arian heresy and was delighted by the conversion of the Visigoths to Catholicism. He was as much concerned with the Germanic kings as with the emperor in whose name he claimed to act, but he was also the doughtiest opponent of the Lombards. For help against them he turned both to the emperor and, more significantly, the Franks. Yet the Lombards also made the Pope, of necessity, a political power. Not only did they cut him off from the imperial representative at Ravenna, but he had to negotiate with them when they stood before the walls of Rome. Like other bishops in the West who inherited civilian authority, he had to feed his city and govern it. Slowly Italians came to see the Pope as successor to Rome as well as to St. Peter. In Gregory the classical Roman heritage and the Christian are subsumed. He represented something new, though he can hardly have seen it like that. Christianity had been a part of the classical heritage, yet it was now turning away from much of it and was distinct from it. Significantly, Gregory did not speak Greek, nor did he feel he needed to. There had already been signs of transformation in the Church's relations with the barbarians. With Gregory, one focus of this story has come at last to be Europe, not the Mediterranean basin. There were already sown in it the seeds of the future, though not of the near future. For most of the world's people, the existence of Europe for the next 1,000 years or so is almost irrelevant. But a Europe is at last discernible, unimaginably different though it may be from what was to come and limited to the west of the continent. It was also decisively different from the past. The ordered, literate, unhurried life of the Roman provinces had given way to a fragmented society with, encamped in it, a warrior aristocracy and their tribesmen, sometimes integrated with the earlier inhabitants, sometimes not. Their chiefs were called kings and were certainly no longer merely chiefs, any more than their followers, after nearly 2 centuries of involvement with what Rome had left behind, were mere barbarians. It was in 550 that a barbarian king, a Goth, for the first time represented himself on his coins decked in the imperial insignia. Through the impression wrought on their imaginations by the relics of a higher culture, through the efficacy of the idea of Rome itself, and through the conscious and unconscious work of the Church, above all, these peoples were on their way to civilization, and their art remains to prove it. Of formal culture, they brought nothing with them to compare with antiquity. There was no barbarian contribution to the civilized intellect. Yet the cultural traffic was not all in one direction at less formal levels. The extent to which Christianity, or at least the Church, was still an elastic form must not be underrated. Everywhere Christianity had to flow in the channels available, and these were defined by layers of paganism, Germanic upon Roman upon Celtic. The conversion of a king like Clovis did not mean that his people made at once even a formal adherence to Christianity. Some were still pagan after generations had passed, as their graves show. But this conservatism presented opportunities as well as obstacles. The Church could utilize the belief in folk magic, or the presence of a holy site which could associate a saint with respect for age-old deities of countryside and forest. Miracles, knowledge of which was assiduously propagated in the saints' lives read aloud to pilgrims to their shrines, were the persuasive arguments of the age. Men were used to the magical interventions of the old Celtic deities or manifestations of Odin's power. For most men then, as it has been for most of human history, the role of religion was not the provision of moral guidance or spiritual insight, but the propitiation of the unseen. Only over blood sacrifice did Christianity draw the line between itself and the pagan past unambiguously. Much other pagan practice and reminiscence it simply christened. The process by which this came about has often been seen as one of decline, and there are certainly reasonable arguments to be made to that effect. In material terms, barbarian Europe was an economically poorer place than the empire of the Antonines. All over Europe tourists gape still at the monuments of Rome's builders, as our barbarian predecessors must have done. Yet out of this confusion something quite new and immeasurably more creative than Rome would emerge in due course. It was perhaps impossible for contemporaries to view what was happening in anything but apocalyptic terms. But some may have seen just a little beyond this, as the concerns of Gregory suggest.